Let the day fade away. Settle into your bed or favorite chair, lower the lights, and let's take a slow journey into the past. If you're enjoying these sleep stories, feel free to give us a like or subscribe, but no pressure at all. Now, let's start our journey. The sun barely stretches over the horizon, casting a soft light on the endless sprawl of the plains, and you, a cowboy of the Wild West, are already awake. It's 5:30 a.m., and the day ahead promises the grit and grind of the frontier life. As you rub the sleep from your eyes, you face the first task on your list, preparing for the long cattle drive. This isn't just a leisurely trot across the countryside, it's a high-stakes enterprise that could make or break the season's profits. Let's start with the basics, your trusty horse. Saddling up isn't just slinging a bit of leather over a nag and calling it a day. Nope, this requires a bit more finesse. Your saddle, a prized possession, is likely worth a small fortune in your world, maybe equivalent to a month's wages if it's a good one. It's not just about comfort, it's about survival. A poorly fitted saddle can spell disaster for both you and your steed during those grueling miles. Speaking of wages, let's talk dollars and cents, or should we say, the lack thereof. As a cowboy, you're pulling in about $25 to $40 a month. That's right, in today's economy, that paycheck wouldn't even cover a decent dinner out. Meanwhile, a decent Stetson hat, a veritable badge of cowboy honor, costs around $5 todogom. That's a whole week's pay on your noggin, but it's a necessary expense. After all, sun protection aside, appearances do matter when you're dealing with cattle barons and fellow cowboys. Before you set off, you've got to pack the essentials, coffee and beans. The caffeine fix is non-negotiable. After all, when you're riding for hours on end, keeping your eyes open can be a real challenge. Beans, meanwhile, are the staple of your diet. They're cheap, filling, and won't spoil on the trail. You might have heard tales of gourmet meals on the range, but let's face it out here, culinary excellence takes a backseat to practicality. The romanticized image of the cowboy, all rugged individualism and freedom, conveniently leaves out these economic realities. Sure, there's a certain appeal to the idea of riding off into the sunset, but it's worth remembering that the cowboy lifestyle is defined by hard work and financial restraint. You're not just herding cattle, you're part of a vast supply chain that feeds growing cities and industries. You're the unsung cog in the machine of American expansion, paving the way for the railroads and settlers who will follow. As you mount your horse, the weight of history feels almost tangible. You're living in a time of rapid change, a period where the push westward is reshaping the very fabric of the nation. This isn't just about your daily grind. It's about survival in a world that's transforming faster than you can ride. The railroads are coming, towns are sprouting up like weeds, and the open range is slowly giving way to fences and property lines. But for now, your focus is on the herd, the trail, and the long day ahead. And maybe, just maybe, there's a bit of glory to be found in the dust and sweat of the cattle drive. As you nudge your horse forward, the morning sun climbs higher, casting a golden hue over the rolling plains. It's time to face the beast that is cattle herding. Forget the Hollywood image of cowboys as trigger-happy gunslingers. The real fight is with Mother Nature, boredom, and the stubborn cattle that refuse to cooperate. Let's tackle the daily grind of the cowboy lifestyle. Imagine covering up to 15 miles a day on horseback. That's right, you're not just meandering through postcard-perfect scenery. You're navigating rugged terrain, keeping a 1,000-pound beast on track, and all while perched on a saddle that's about as comfortable as a barbed wire hammock. If you've ever complained about your office chair, try spending a day in the saddle. Your posterior will have a whole new appreciation for ergonomics. And speaking of those stubborn cattle, they're not exactly the most cooperative of companions. Each steer has its own idea of where to go, and it's rarely in the direction you want. Wrestling a steer back into line isn't just a tug of war, it's a full-body workout that would put any CrossFit session to shame. This isn't just about muscle, it's about patience, and maybe a little bit of cowboy cursing under your breath. Now, let's debunk a myth or two. The Wild West wasn't wall-to-wall gunfights and duels. In fact, the average cowboy was more likely to be caught in a showdown with a thunderstorm than a bandit. Sure, there were outlaws, but the real threats were far more mundane and far more dangerous. Stampedes, for instance. When a herd spooks, it's like 1,000 freight trains barreling towards you. You're not just fighting to save the cattle, you're fighting for your life. And let's not forget river crossings. Ever try to convince a herd of cattle that they should swim across a river? It's like herding cats, if cats weighed a ton and had a penchant for drowning. But back to those gunfights. The reality is, bullets were expensive, and cowboys were more interested in protecting their meagre earnings than wasting them on shootouts. It wasn't about flash and flare, it was about pragmatism and survival. In fact, the average cowboy's biggest enemy was boredom. Hours of riding in silence with nothing but the sound of hooves and the occasional grunt of a steer. It's enough to drive anyone to distraction. And then there's the weather. Out here, the elements aren't just a backdrop, they're a force to be reckoned with. The sun beats down relentlessly, and when it rains, it pours. There's no shelter from the storm on the open plains. You're exposed, vulnerable, and at the mercy of nature's whims. It's a humbling reminder that despite the romanticized image of the cowboy as a rugged individualist, you're ultimately just a tiny speck in the vast landscape of the American West. Now, let's talk danger. The real threats on the trail were far more mundane and far more dangerous than any gunfight. Stampedes could start from the tiniest of spooks, a rattlesnake, a sudden clap of thunder, or even the shadow of a cloud. And when a herd panics, it's like 1,000 freight trains barreling towards you. You're not just fighting to save the cattle, you're fighting for your life. And then there's the river crossings. Imagine trying to convince a herd of cattle that they should swim across a river. It's like herding cats, if cats weighed a ton and had a penchant for drowning. By mid-morning you've already traversed a good chunk of those 15 miles, and you're feeling every inch of it. Your muscles ache, and your stomach grumbles with the promise of a noon meal that's probably just more beans. But there's a certain satisfaction in the grind, a sense of purpose that comes from the hard work and the knowledge that you're part of something bigger. You're not just moving cattle, you're driving the economy, feeding a nation that's expanding westward at a breakneck pace. And while the romance of the cowboy life might be more myth than reality, there's a certain pride in knowing that you're living, the history that will one day be told in songs and stories. So, as you ride into the late morning sun, with the dust of the trail in your lungs and the weight of a nation on your shoulders, take a moment to appreciate the reality of the cowboy life. It's not all gunfights and glory, but it's a hell of a ride. And who knows? Maybe the next time someone tells a tall tale about the Wild West, they'll remember the truth behind the myth, the grit, the grind, and the indomitable spirit of the cowboy. And speaking of rides, it's time to park that horse and dig into what passes for lunch out here on the trail. Welcome to the midday meal, a moment of solace in the cowboy's relentless schedule. If you've been picturing a spread fit for a Marlborough man, complete with sizzling steaks and frosty beers, it's time for a reality check. The true fare is a culinary masterpiece called chuck, and yes, it's as glamorous as it sounds. Let's start with the star of the show, beans. These legumes are to cowboys what oxygen is to the rest of us. Absolutely essential. Why beans, you ask? Well, beans are cheap. They last forever without refrigeration, and they pack a decent punch of protein. Add to that a smattering of salt pork, a dash of whatever spices the cook could scrounge, and you've got yourself a meal. It's a bit like a mystery stew, where the mystery is what's actually in it today. On a good day, you might find a surprise chunk of meat, but let's not get too excited here. It's no filet mignon. Into the chuck wagon, the mobile kitchen and nerve centre of any cattle drive. Picture a sturdy wooden wagon, packed tighter than a sardine can with pots, pans, and enough dried provisions to feed a small army of hungry cowboys. This rolling galley was the brainchild of Charles Goodnight. Great name for a cowboy, right? A cattleman who realized that keeping his drovers fed was the key to a successful drive. In 1866, Goodnight introduced the first chuck wagon, modifying a surplus army wagon to include a chuck box with compartments for all the culinary essentials. It was genius, really. In a world where innovation meant finding new ways to survive, the chuck wagon was a game changer. Now, the real hero of this midday pause is the camp cook, often referred to as cookie. Forget the romanticized image of a grizzled old-timer with a heart of gold. The cook was more like a drill sergeant with a ladle. This was not a job for the faint-hearted. The cook was up before dawn, often the first to rise and the last to rest. He was responsible for not only fueling the crew, but also maintaining peace among a group of weary and sometimes ornery cowboys. You see, the chuck wagon was more than just a kitchen. It was the social hub of the trail. If there were disagreements or disputes among the crew, they were usually settled here over a plate of beans and a steaming cup of coffee. The cook wielded more power than a cattle boss might like to admit. He set the meal schedule, dictated the menu, and heaven help the cowboy who showed up late or complained about the food. You might say the cook was the original influencer, shaping the mood and morale of the entire outfit with a single meal. And let's not forget the culinary challenges. Cooking over an open flame in unpredictable weather, with ingredients that were often more guess and hope than tried and true. The cook's ability to churn out a hot meal under these conditions was nothing short of miraculous. For all its rough edges, the chuckwagon meal was a cornerstone of cowboy camaraderie. Imagine a circle of dusty, sunburned cowboys gathered around the wagon, swapping stories, sharing jokes, and momentarily forgetting the aches and exhaustion of the trail. It was a time to bond, to laugh, and, yes, to complain about the beans for the umpteenth time. In a world that was often solitary and harsh, this shared meal was a rare moment of community and connection. From the outside, it might seem like a scene from a Western postcard, but dig a little deeper and you'll find the grittier realities. The chuckwagon wasn't just a place for camaraderie, it was also a stage for conflict. Tempers could flare, and when they did, the cook was often the de facto mediator. His word was law. It had to be. With knives and tempers equally sharp, a little diplomacy went a long way. This midday pause was more than just a break in the day. It was a microcosm of cowboy life, a chance for the men to reflect on their journey, to share a laugh, and to remind themselves why they were out here in the first place. They were part of a grand narrative, a chapter in the saga of American expansion. Each meal was a reminder that they were not alone in this vast, untamed land. As you chew on that last bite of beans, it's worth considering the sheer audacity of it all. These cowboys were the backbone of a burgeoning economy, and the humble chuckwagon was their lifeline. It was a testament to ingenuity and survival, a symbol of the hard-edged reality behind the romanticized legend of the Wild West. So as you dust off your chaps and prepare to mount up once more, remember that cowboy life was more than just cattle drives and sunsets. It was grit, determination, and the occasional chuckle over a pot of beans. And that, my friend, is the real taste of the trail. As you nudge those last stubborn beans around your tin plate, the afternoon sun begins its lazy descent, casting long shadows across the plains. This is when the real magic of the cowboy life unfurls, when the harsh glare of the day softens and the rugged camaraderie of the trail transforms into something almost poetic. It's time to dive deeper into the cultural tapestry that makes up this iconic lifestyle. And spoiler alert, it's not all white hats and Anglo faces. Here's a stat that'll knock the spurs off your boots. Up to 25% of cowboys were African American, Mexican, or Native American. That's right, the monochrome image of the cowboy, popularized by countless westerns, is about as accurate as a spaghetti western's geography. It's high time we set the record straight and paint this picture with all the colors it deserves. Imagine the cattle drives of the late 19th century as a microcosm of diversity. African-American cowboys, often freed slaves or their descendants, found a rare level of equality on the open range that they were denied elsewhere. The harsh truth is, the frontier offered more than just opportunity. It offered a chance to escape systemic racism and build a life on the back of sheer grit. Meanwhile, Mexican vaqueros, the original horsemen of the Americas, brought with them centuries of ranching expertise. Their skills were indispensable, and many of the techniques they pioneered, like lassoing, became staples of cowboy culture. And let's not forget the Native American cowboys. Despite the brutal realities of displacement and cultural oppression, some Native Americans became integral to ranching operations, bringing a deep understanding of the land that was often lost on newcomers. It's a testament to resilience and adaptability, a stark reminder that the cowboy story is also a story of survival against the odds. This motley crew of cowboys painted a vibrant tableau across the dusty canvas of the American West. It was a cultural melting pot long before the term became trendy, an accidental social experiment born of necessity and opportunity. Yet, despite their critical roles, these cowboys of color have often been left out of the story. But not today, folks. Today, we're giving them their due. As the daylight wanes, another essential aspect of cowboy life comes into focus: music and folklore. If you think cowboys spent their evenings silently brooding under the stars, think again. The nights were alive with songs, stories, and the occasional tall tale that stretched the truth like a well-worn pair of chaps. Cowboy music was the original Spotify playlist of the range, a mix of ballads, work songs, and lyrical tales that told of love, loss, and the sheer absurdity of life on the trail. Enter the cowboy ballad, a musical form that echoes the trials and triumphs of the cattle drive. These songs were passed around like a communal jug of whiskey, each singer adding their own twist. They served as both entertainment and oral history, preserving the exploits of legendary cowboys and infamous outlaws. Songs like Home on the Range and The Streets of Laredo became anthems of the open plains, encapsulating the spirit of the West in a few simple chords. But let's not get too starry-eyed here. The cowboy life was no Broadway musical. These songs often masked the harsh realities with a veneer of romance. It's easy to get swept up in the nostalgia, but remember, these were stories crafted to distract from the blisters and boredom. They were a way to build community, to inject a bit of warmth into the cold night air, and to remind each cowboy that they were part of something larger than themselves, a living, breathing legend in the making. And then there were the tales. Oh, the tales! Cowboys were master storytellers, spinning yarns that blurred the line between fact and fiction. Some stories were rooted in truth, while others were as far-fetched as a Hollywood Western. The legend of Pecos Bill, for instance, is pure fiction, but it captures the essence of cowboy bravado and the wild spirit of the frontier. These stories were the Netflix of the night, offering drama, comedy, and a touch of the fantastical to weary cowboys gathered around the campfire. The cultural tapestry of the cowboy life was as rich as it was rugged, woven with threads of diverse backgrounds and shared experiences. It's a reminder that the cowboy myth, despite its inaccuracies, holds a kernel of truth. It speaks to the human spirit's capacity for endurance and imagination, for forging connections in the unlikeliest of places. As the stars begin to twinkle overhead, casting their ancient light on the endless plains, you can almost hear the echoes of those cowboy songs and stories. They are whispers from the past, reminders of a life that was both brutal and beautiful, a life lived on the edge of civilization where identity was as fluid as the open range. So next time you picture a cowboy, remember the true mosaic of faces that once carved out a living under the vast western sky. It's a story of diversity, resilience, and the enduring power of music and myth. And as the evening settles in, know that the legend of the cowboy is far more complex than any Hollywood script could ever capture. It's a tale of survival, community, and the indomitable human spirit. A story still being told, one song and one story at a time. Even as the stars dot the sky, twinkling like cosmic Morse code, the cowboy's day isn't quite ready to hit the hay. There's a reflection to be had. A moment to consider the transformation of the cowboy from a gritty, dust-covered laborer to the polished icon of American culture. This metamorphosis is like watching a caterpillar become a butterfly, though with a lot more cow manure and less graceful flapping. Let's rewind to the late 1800s. The cowboy's life was all about grit and grind, but as the open range began to close up shop, the landscape of the West changed faster than a rattlesnake's mood on a hot day. Enter barbed wire, patented in 1874 by Joseph Glidden. This little invention was the real game-changer. Picture barbed wire as the Facebook of the 19th century, connecting people, drawing lines, and occasionally causing a fight or two. It allowed ranchers to fence off their land, effectively putting an end to the romantic notion of the open range. Cowboys now found themselves with fewer miles to roam and more fences to mend. And then there were the railroads. These iron beasts chugged across the plains, shrinking the world and expanding markets. By the 1880s, railroads had laid down over 72,000 miles of track, weaving a steel web across America. Suddenly, cattle drives, those epic treks that defined cowboy life, were about as necessary as a screen door on a submarine. Cattle could be shipped by train, turning what was once a lengthy, arduous journey into a quick and efficient process. For cowboys, this was the equivalent of Amazon Prime, but instead of packages, it was 1,000 head of cattle. The decline of the open range and the rise of railroads spelled the end of an era. Cowboys found themselves out of a job or forced to adapt to new roles. Some became ranch hands, others drifted into burgeoning towns, and a few even tried their luck in the gold rush. Yet, as the dust settled, the cowboy had already begun his transformation into a symbol, a rugged emblem of the frontier spirit etched into the American psyche. What fueled this iconic transformation? Hollywood, of course. As the 20th century rolled in, filmmakers saw the cowboy as cinematic gold. Enter the Western film, where cowboys became larger-than-life heroes, battling outlaws and taming the wild frontier. These films were a nostalgic nod to a bygone era, a way to romanticize a life that was rapidly disappearing under the onslaught of modernity. John Wayne, Clint Eastwood. These actors rode into movie theaters and into the hearts of audiences, cementing the cowboy's status as an American legend. But let's not get swept away by the silver screen's glamour. The real-life cowboy was more likely to face a stubborn steer than a showdown at high noon. Yet, the myth endures because it speaks to something deeper, the yearning for freedom, adventure, and a simpler time. It's the ultimate American daydream, fueled by the desire to escape the confines of the modern world and return to a life where the horizon was limitless. This cowboy myth continues to influence American culture in more ways than you might think. Consider the rugged individualism it promotes, a trait often celebrated in political rhetoric and cultural values. The cowboy is the original, pick yourself up by your bootstraps kind of guy, even if those boots were caked in mud and manure. His image evokes a sense of self-reliance and resilience, qualities that resonate in a nation built on the frontier spirit. And let's not forget fashion. The cowboy hat, boots, and denim jeans have become fashion staples, worn by everyone from ranchers to rock stars. In 2009, the global cowboy boots market was valued at about 1.8 billion, proof that the cowboy's influence goes well beyond the silver screen. Yet, as we tip our hats to the myth, we shouldn't ignore the gritty truth. The cowboy life was no picnic. It was built on hard labor, low pay, and a constant battle with the elements. It was a life of endurance, where every day was a reminder of nature's unforgiving beauty. This dichotomy between the myth and the reality is what makes the cowboy so compelling. It's a story of survival and spirit, one that continues to inspire and intrigue. So, as the campfire dies down and the chill of the night settles in, take a moment to appreciate the legacy of the cowboy. It's a tale of transformation, from rugged laborer to American icon, from reality to legend. And while the truth might be less glamorous than the movies would have us believe, it's no less remarkable. The cowboy endures because he embodies the best of us, the courage to face the unknown, the tenacity to keep going when the going gets tough, and the imagination to dream of a better tomorrow. And that, my friend, is the real trail the cowboy blazed, one that winds through history, culture, and the human heart. As the stars watch over the sleeping plains, know that the cowboy's spirit rides on, forever part of the American landscape. In the dusty, bustling state of Lu in 551 BC, a baby named Kong Chu entered the world, destined for a life that would be more sitcom than serene sage. Lu, a place that barely made it onto the map of ancient China, was Confucius's starting point. Not exactly the birthplace you'd expect for a man who'd become a philosophical heavyweight. But, hey, every legend has to start somewhere, even if it's in a state less known for wisdom and more for its political fiascos. Confucius, or Kongzi as they called him back then, wasn't born with a silver spoon. In fact, his family couldn't even afford a spoon. His father, a low-ranking knight, died when Confucius was just 3, leaving the family poorer than a temple mouse. Young Kongzi and his mother were left to fend for themselves, which meant Confucius spent his early years doing all sorts of odd jobs. You know, the kind of gigs that make you question your life choices, like herding sheep and accounting grain, hardly the glamorous setup for a future philosopher king. Now, you'd think a guy who ends up teaching rulers would have aced school, right? But Confucius didn't exactly have the elite education. Instead, he was mostly self-taught, diving into the ancient texts like a bookworm without a library card. He developed a knack for quoting the ancient classics, which would later become his teaching trademark, kind of like a vintage tweetstorm, but with more gravitas. Confucius's first foray into the world of politics was as unlikely as a cat herding sheep. He got a minor government post, a job he probably landed more because of persistence than pedigree. But he wasn't just some paper pusher, he had ideas. Big ones. He envisioned a world where rulers actually cared about their people, Revolutionary, right? But in a time when political leaders were more interested in power plays than people's welfare, his ideas were about as popular as a porcupine in a balloon factory. Despite his earnest attempts to play the Game of Thrones, Confucius's political career was more of a blooper reel than a highlight reel. He spent years bouncing between jobs, never quite finding the right fit, like a pair of shoes that always pinched. Part of the problem? His penchant for blunt honesty. In a court where flattery was the currency of choice, Confucius's straightforwardness made him about as welcome as a skunk at a garden party. But if there was one thing Confucius was undeniably good at, it was teaching. He gathered a ragtag bunch of students, the kind who couldn't afford the fancy academies. These young men, drawn to his wit and wisdom, became the first Confucians, soaking up his lessons like sponges. Confucius taught them everything from morality to music, emphasizing virtues like filial piety and righteousness. He had a way with words, sure, but he also had a way of getting under his students' skin. His teaching style was more Socratic than soothing, often challenging them with questions that left them scratching their heads and questioning their life choices. Now, this is where we bust a myth or two. The popular image of Confucius as a wise old sage, serene and unflappable, is about as accurate as the historical drama on TV. In reality, Confucius had more than his fair share of frustrations and faux pas. He was known to be grumpy and impatient at times, especially when his students weren't quite catching on to his grand ideas. But these very human traits make him relatable. Like a teacher whose coffee hasn't kicked in yet, trying to explain calculus to a room of sleepy teenagers. Confucius's struggle to be taken seriously by the political elite was a recurring theme in his life. Rulers of the time were more interested in military might and economic gain than in Confucius's idealistic visions of moral governance. Despite his best efforts, he was often sidelined, his advice dismissed as naive or impractical. Yet, it was precisely these struggles that fueled his teachings, adding a layer of grit to his philosophy that resonated with the common people. Confucius's experiences in the political arena were less about triumph and more about tenacity. He once famously said, "It does not matter how slowly you go as long as you do not stop." It's a sentiment that echoes through his life, from his humble beginnings to his relentless pursuit of a better society. He was a man who kept going, even when the odds were about as encouraging as a rainy day parade. In the end, Confucius's journey was not a straight line to success, but a meandering path dotted with both laughter and lessons. His early life and political misadventures might not fit the mold of a serene sage, but they paint a picture of a man who was as complex as the world he tried to change. This was Confucius, a philosopher who started as a simple man in Lu, armed with nothing but ideas and the audacity to believe they mattered. And while he might not have seen his dreams realized in his lifetime, his teachings endured, proving that sometimes the best stories are the ones that take a little longer to unfold. But Confucius wasn't just a philosopher with his head in the clouds. He was a man on a mission, or at least trying to be. He set his sights on the gritty world of politics, convinced that he'd bring about a governance revolution. He had this crazy notion that people should actually be rewarded for their talents and virtues rather than their family ties. Imagine suggesting that meritocracy should trump aristocracy back in ancient China. It was like proposing to turn the Great Wall into a theme park. While today we might nod along like it's a no-brainer, back then it was as radical as a rock band at a poetry reading. So, how did our guy Confucius fare when faced with the political machine? Well, picture an optimistic intern trying to change corporate culture on day one. He was ready to shake things up, but soon found himself knee-deep in bureaucracy thicker than a Beijing smog day. In his role as a minor official, Confucius tried to implement his ideas, but the ruling class looked at him like he was trying to sell them sand in the desert. His ideas weren't just forward-thinking, they were practically time-traveling. You see, Confucius had a vision where rulers led by example, like moral compasses, guiding their ships through the stormy seas of governance. He believed that if the king was righteous, the people would follow suit. But in reality, the rulers were more interested in lavish banquets than leading by ethical example. It was like trying to teach a cat to fetch, amusing to watch, but ultimately futile. His attempts to steer the political ship towards ethical waters were about as successful as a paper umbrella in a hurricane. Confucius's notion of governance was revolutionary. He argued for a system where officials were chosen based on their abilities and character rather than their noble bloodlines. Meritocracy, not aristocracy, was his rallying cry. But his radical ideas went over about as well as tofu at a steakhouse. The aristocrats were not going to hand over power to a bunch of commoners with brains instead of blue blood. Confucius was trying to play chess, while everyone else was busy with checkers, and, unsurprisingly, he found himself on the losing end more often than not. His political career was peppered with incidents that read more like a slapstick comedy than a sage's journey. Take, for instance, the time he was appointed as the Minister of Crime. This seemed like a chance to shine, but it turned into a lesson in the futility of idealism. Confucius believed that crime could be curbed by instilling virtue in the people, but the criminals were less interested in morality than in avoiding the stocks. His attempts to reform the justice system were met with the kind of enthusiasm you'd expect from a teenager faced with cleaning their room. As if that wasn't enough, there was the infamous incident with the Duke of Lu. The Duke, preferring pomp over policy, was more concerned with entertaining a visiting dance troupe than addressing the state's governance. Confucius, in his candid fashion, gave the Duke a piece of his mind, a move that was about as diplomatically savvy as a bull in a china shop. Unsurprisingly, this led to Confucius being shown the door, not exactly the graceful exit of a revered statesman. Disillusioned but not defeated, Confucius realized that the political world was more interested in preserving the status quo than in embracing his visionary ideas. He was a square peg trying to fit into a round hole, and the friction was palpable. His dreams of high office and transformative change faded faster than his hopes for a morally upright government. It was clear that his ideas were pearls before swine, and that the political elite were more interested in maintaining their grip on power than in ushering in an era of enlightened governance. In a way, Confucius's political journey was a testament to the universal truth that idealism and politics often mix about as well as oil and water. His story is a reminder that sometimes the most profound changes aren't born from the halls of power, but from the voices that call out from the fringes. Confucius left the political stage with his idealism intact, even if his hopes for immediate reform were dashed. He had learned the hard way that the world of politics was a maze, not a straight path, and those who navigate it must be prepared for dead ends and detours. But don't go thinking this was the end of the road for Confucius. Oh no, he was just getting started. Though his political career was a bust, his ideas were far from extinguished. He turned back to teaching with the fervour of a man who had seen the other side and lived to tell the tale. His students became his legacy, the seeds of his philosophy that would grow long after the political winds had shifted. And while Confucius might not have been the political reformer he aspired to be, his teachings endured, influencing generations long after he'd hung up his bureaucratic hat. So, as Confucius departed the political scene, he did so with a newfound clarity. His ambition to reshape governance had hit a wall, but his resolve to shape minds was stronger than ever. The world of politics might not have been ready for Confucius, but history would prove that Confucius was more than ready for the world. His legacy, like a well-tended garden, would flourish in ways he couldn't have imagined long after the political figures of his day were forgotten footnotes in history books. And so, Confucius, having gracefully exited the political circus, found himself at a crossroads, both literally and figuratively. With his political ambitions boxed up like last season's fashion, he hit the road with a trail of disciples in tow, aiming to spread his philosophical gospel across the patchwork of Chinese states. But before you get images of Confucius as some kind of ancient rock star on tour, let me set the record straight. This was less about sold-out arenas and more about surviving on a shoestring. We're talking about a guy who, despite his wisdom, had to haggle for dinner like a backpacker on a budget. The journey was no stroll in the imperial gardens. Confucius and his band of merry men wandered through territories that were as tumultuous as a soap opera. The Chinese states were embroiled in the spring and autumn period, a time when political alliances changed faster than the weather. Each state was a microcosm of chaos, with rulers more interested in annexing neighbours than entertaining Confucian ideals of benevolence and virtue. It was like trying to sell pacifism at a gladiator match, noble, but mostly ignored. As Confucius and his disciples ambled along dusty roads, they encountered everything from curious farmers to skeptical scholars. Their mission was simple, yet Herculean, to convince these folks that morality and virtue should guide their lives, not just their rulers. Naturally, this noble pursuit often resulted in Confucius being the butt of jokes, more often than he probably have liked. Picture a wise old man trying to preach the virtues of kindness, only to be met with quips that would make even a stand-up comedian blush. You see, Confucius might have had the charisma of a seasoned orator, but he was still just one man against a backdrop of political instability and economic hardship. In a land where warlords ruled and food was scarce, not everyone had the luxury to ponder the meaning of life. The average farmer was more concerned with the yield of his crops than the yield of his virtues, yet Confucius persisted, undeterred by hunger or harsh words, like a philosophical marathon runner with no finish line in sight. His travels took him to the state of Qi, where he hoped to find ears more receptive to his ideals. However, the Qi rulers were preoccupied with military campaigns, and Confucius's teachings were as welcome as a fly in their soup. It's no wonder Confucius often found himself moving on, leaving behind a trail of unconverted skeptics. But not all was lost. In the state of Wei, he gained a small but devoted following, his teachings resonating with those who were disillusioned by the constant power struggles. One of the more memorable stops was in the state of Chen, where Confucius and his disciples faced dire straits. Food was scarce, and they were forced to live on a diet that would make a minimalist proud. The situation got so desperate that Confucius reportedly remarked, "A gentleman can withstand want, but he cannot withstand the absence of virtue." A noble sentiment, but clearly virtue doesn't fill empty bellies. This period of hunger was a test of resilience, and while Confucius's philosophical resolve remained unbroken, his stomach had other opinions. Amidst the mockery and the meals that would barely pass for appetizers, Confucius never lost sight of his mission. He believed that his ideas could plant seeds of change, even in the most barren of minds. His journey was as much about spreading his message as it was about learning from the people he met. He was a sponge, absorbing the nuances of each state's culture and governance, refining his teachings with each new encounter. It was this adaptability that allowed his philosophy to endure, even as the political landscape shifted like sand dunes in a desert storm. Confucius's wanderings were also marked by encounters with those who saw potential in his ideas. In the state of Song, he found a ruler who was intrigued by his concepts of moral leadership. But, as was often the case, the allure of power proved stronger than the call of virtue. The ruler's interest waned, leaving Confucius once again on the move. It was a recurring theme, promising beginnings followed by disappointing endings, a cycle as predictable as the seasons. Yet, amidst the setbacks, Confucius's ragtag band of disciples grew. These young men, drawn by his wisdom and wit, were the lifeblood of his philosophical mission. They were as varied as the states they travelled through, yet unified by a shared belief in Confucius's teachings. Together, they braved the challenges of the road, enduring hunger and hardship with the kind of camaraderie that only shared struggles can forge. They were the unsung heroes of Confucius's story, the ones who carried his message long after the man himself had left the stage. Despite the skepticism and the scoffing, or perhaps because of it, Confucius became a figure of fascination. His persistence in the face of adversity earned him both ridicule and respect. It was this very human aspect of his journey, the resilience, the humour, the occasional misstep, that made his teachings relatable. He was not some untouchable sage, but a man who lived his philosophy, flaws and all. It's a narrative that resonates with the timeless human struggle for meaning amidst chaos. So, how did this wandering philosopher, often more mocked than marvelled at, become a cornerstone of Chinese thought? Well, that's the million-yuan question, isn't it? Confucius's ideas, though not immediately embraced, were seeds planted in fertile soil. Over time, those seeds took root, nurtured by the very instability that initially rejected them. His teaching spoke to a fundamental desire for order and morality in a world that seemed to lack both. And so, Confucius continued his journey across the states, undeterred by the laughter and the lean times. His legacy was not built on political triumphs or grand gestures, but on the quiet, persistent spread of his ideas. He was a man who understood that change was a marathon, not a sprint, and he was content to take one step at a time, even if the path was as winding as the Great Wall itself. His story is a testament to the power of perseverance in the face of adversity. Confucius may not have been the savior of the states he visited, but he was the savior of the ideas that would shape them for centuries to come. His wanderings were not just a journey through the states, but a journey through the human condition, filled with all its complexities and contradictions. It was this journey that laid the foundation for his enduring legacy, a legacy that would outlast the very states that once dismissed him. As the road stretched on before him, Confucius remained undaunted, a philosopher with a purpose, armed with nothing but his ideas and the audacity to believe they mattered. His story was far from over, and neither was his impact on the world. The teachings of this wandering sage would continue to echo through the ages, long after the laughter had faded and the skeptics had been silenced by the passage of time. Confucius, having danced the diplomatic jig across the Chinese states with about as much success as a lead-footed ballerina, eventually found his compass pointing back to Lu. It was a return to the familiar like slipping into a pair of worn shoes that had moulded to his feet over the miles. But this was not the same man who had left. The years of wandering had etched wisdom into his very bones, the kind that couldn't be gleaned from scrolls alone. In Lu, Confucius traded the chaos of courts for the calm of classrooms. He shifted his focus to education and writing, deciding that if he couldn't change the rulers, he'd change the ruled. And boy, did he have a lot to say. Confucius began documenting his thoughts, a move that would make your average blogger look like a slacker. His writings became the blueprint for generations of scholars and bureaucrats to come. The Analects, a collection of his sayings and ideas compiled by his disciples, read like an ancient Twitter feed, short, punchy, and packed with more wisdom per inch than a fortune cookie factory. Confucius's reflections on failure and success were as much about his own journey as they were philosophical musings. He understood that success wasn't a straight line, but a squiggly maze, where every dead end was just another lesson learned. Our greatest glory is not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall, he'd say, a sentiment that's as applicable today as it was in 5th century BCE China. It was this resilience that became the backbone of his teachings, a reminder that failure is not the opposite of success, but a stepping stone to it. His ideas on ethics and morality began to gain traction, not in the grand halls of power, but in the minds of those who listened. Confucius was like a moral Pied Piper, drawing followers with his vision of a society rooted in virtue. His teachings emphasized the importance of relationships between ruler and subject, parent and child, husband and wife. It was a kind of moral geometry, where the angles of human interaction had to be just right for harmony to prevail. And let's be honest, who doesn't love a good angle? But lest we get too swept away by the romance of Confucius's wisdom, let's not forget his penchant for pedantry. His students often found themselves caught in the crosshairs of his literal interpretations. When asked how to serve ghosts and spirits, Confucius's reply was classic. "You are not able to serve men, how can you serve spirits?" A pragmatic response, sure, but it was about as comforting as a cold shower. His approach was like a philosophical boot camp, where questions were met with more questions, an infuriating exercise for anyone looking for straight answers. Confucius's return to Lu also marked a period of intense reflection. He was like a seasoned sailor, having weathered the storms of political indifference and social upheaval. He knew that true success wasn't measured by titles or wealth, but by the impact of one's ideas. And so he poured himself into his work, his pen as mighty as any sword. This was a man on a mission, armed with nothing but ink, and the audacity to believe he could reshape the moral fabric of his society. Economically, Lu was a state in flux. The constant power struggles of the Zhou dynasty had left it with as many holes as a sieve. Confucius's teachings were a beacon of stability amidst the chaos, offering a moral compass in a time when compasses were desperately needed. His call for a government led by virtuous rulers resonated with the common people, who were wary of leaders who treated virtue like an inconvenient afterthought. It was an idea whose time had come, even if the elite weren't quite ready to embrace it. Ironically, Confucius's fame began to grow after his death in 479 BCE, a classic case of being more popular in the afterlife than in life. As the centuries rolled on, his teachings were enshrined in texts that became the backbone of the Chinese educational system. The Confucian classics became required reading, much like the musty tomes college students begrudgingly lug around today. His vision of a meritocratic society eventually took root. a testament to the enduring power of his ideas. Yet Confucius wasn't just a thinker, he was a man who lived his philosophy. He embodied the virtues he preached: filial piety, righteousness, integrity, making him a walking, talking advertisement for his own teachings. It was this authenticity that drew people to him, like moths to a flame. He was a sage for the ages, whose legacy would influence not just China, but the world. As Confucius settled into his role as an educator back in Lu, he realized that his failures in politics were not the end, but rather the beginning of a new chapter. He was like a craftsman, chiseling away at the marble of human nature to reveal the statue within. His life was a testament to the idea that success is not about achieving a singular goal, but about the journey of growth and learning. It was a lesson as timeless as it was profound. So, there you have it. Confucius, the man who walked away from the political circus, returned to Lu with a mission to shape the minds of the future. In doing so, he laid the foundations for a legacy that would echo through the corridors of time. His teachings, once dismissed as idealistic ramblings, became the bedrock of Chinese thought, proof that sometimes the most radical ideas take a while to gain traction. Confucius's story is one of perseverance, wisdom, and a touch of stubbornness, a reminder that the best stories are those that endure long after the storyteller has left the stage. Confucius's story was far from over, as his teachings slowly seeped into the fabric of Chinese society like ink into rice paper. The Analects, the collection of his sayings and conversations compiled by his disciples, became the Bible of Confucian thought. Think of it as the ancient version of a self-help bestseller, but with fewer cheesy metaphors and more moral substance. The Analects provided a roadmap for ethical living, emphasizing virtues like loyalty, propriety, and the ever-elusive concept of ren, or humanness. It was like a philosophical Swiss army knife, suitable for any moral conundrum. Now, let's talk about Confucius's legacy, which is as layered as a millefeuille pastry. On one hand, you've got the romanticized image of Confucius as the ultimate wise man, a flawless sage whose every word dripped with profound insight. This version is about as nuanced as a superhero comic, appealing but far from the truth. On the other hand, there's the real Confucius, a complex, sometimes contradictory figure who struggled with the same human flaws as the rest of us. He could be grumpy, impatient, and occasionally dogmatic, qualities that don't quite fit the mold of a serene sage. The irony of Confucius's journey from misunderstood philosopher to a cornerstone of Chinese wisdom is rich, to say the least. During his lifetime, he was often dismissed as a dreamer, his ideas seen as quaint musings in a world obsessed with power and wealth. Fast forward a few centuries, and suddenly his teachings became the gold standard for governance and personal conduct. It's the classic tale of the underdog finally getting his due, albeit posthumously. Confucius's transformation into the symbol of Chinese wisdom was like a long, overdue Oscar win for an actor who'd spent decades in relative obscurity. Economically speaking, Confucius's ideas were a breath of fresh air in a society where inequality was as rampant as the colds in a kindergarten classroom. His emphasis on meritocracy over aristocracy was a radical departure from the status quo, challenging the entrenched social hierarchies that had long favored birthright over ability. It was a revolutionary concept in a time when your family tree was more important than your personal achievements. Confucius was advocating for a world where people were valued for their virtues, not their lineage, a vision that took centuries to materialize, but eventually became a core tenet of Chinese bureaucracy. Politically, Confucius's teachings offered a blueprint for ethical governance that resonated deeply with later dynasties. The Han Dynasty, in particular, embraced Confucianism as the official state ideology, a decision that would have left Confucius both amazed and amused. After all, this was the same Han Dynasty that initially favored legalism, a philosophy about as cuddly as a cactus. But as Confucianism took root, it became synonymous with Chinese identity, shaping everything from the imperial examinations to the Confucian temples that dotted the landscape like moral beacons. The enduring relevance of Confucius's ideas lies in their adaptability. His teachings were not rigid doctrines, but flexible guidelines that could be applied to the ever-changing tapestry of human society. This adaptability ensured that Confucianism remained relevant, even as China transformed from a collection of warring states into a unified empire. The Analects, with their timeless wisdom and practical advice, became a touchstone for generations seeking to navigate the complexities of life with integrity and honor. But let's not get carried away with the romance of it all. Confucius's rise to fame was not without its challenges. His teachings often clashed with other philosophical schools, like Taoism and Buddhism, which offered competing visions of the world. Confucius was like the straight-laced professor in a faculty filled with free-spirited artists. His emphasis on order and discipline sometimes seemed rigid compared to the more mystical and introspective philosophies that emerged during China's philosophical golden age. Yet despite these tensions, Confucianism endured, its principles woven into the very fabric of Chinese culture. It became more than just a philosophy, it was a way of life, influencing everything from family structure to government policy. Confucius's vision of a harmonious society, where every individual knew their role and fulfilled it with devotion, became the ideal against which all others were measured. It was a vision that resonated deeply in a society seeking stability amidst the chaos of human existence. As we reflect on Confucius's legacy, it's clear that his ideas have transcended time, offering insights that are as relevant today as they were 2,500 years ago. His teachings remind us that true wisdom is not about having all the answers, but about asking the right questions. In a world where the pace of change can feel overwhelming, Confucius's emphasis on introspection and ethical living offers a comforting anchor. So, as we close the book on Confucius's journey, let's remember him not just as a sage, but as a human being who dared to challenge the status quo. His life was a testament to the power of perseverance, a reminder that even the most profound ideas can start small, like seeds waiting for the right conditions to grow. Confucius's story is a celebration of the enduring power of ideas, proof that sometimes the most significant changes begin with a single voice speaking truth to power. In the end, Confucius achieved something truly remarkable. He became the philosopher king he never got to be in life. His teachings have outlived empires, weathered revolutions, and continue to inspire people across the globe. The journey from a dusty corner of Lu to the annals of history was long and winding, but it was a journey worth taking. Confucius may not have changed the world in his lifetime, but he laid the groundwork for a legacy that would do just that. And really, isn't that the greatest glory of all? The dawn of ancient Greek theatre is less like a well-lit stage and more like a muddled backstage brawl. Picture the 6th century BCE, where Athens is less about democracy and more about Dionysus, the god of wine, fertility, and, curiously enough, ritual madness. It's here that what we now call theatre took its first steps, or perhaps stumbled drunkenly forward. The story goes that theatre emerged from religious ceremonies dedicated to Dionysus, and while that's not entirely false, it's a bit like saying the internet was invented just to send emails. The reality? It's all about the layers. Let's start with the religious angle because, hey, that's the hook that sells. You've got these Dionysian festivals, especially the city Dionysia, held in Athens every year. Think of it as Coachella, but with more sacrifice and less sunscreen. During these events, people would gather to celebrate Dionysus with a mix of song, dance, and, yes, a fair amount of drinking. These rituals weren't just for fun, they were intense, emotional affairs, blurring the lines between performer and spectator. The Greeks were all about that communal experience, the catharsis, the shedding of personal identity to become part of something bigger. But hold on, before we get too swept up in the romance of it all, let's talk logistics. These festivals weren't just spontaneous outbreaks of joy, they were meticulously organized events. The city Dionysia, for example, was planned months in advance, and it wasn't cheap. The state funded these spectacles, with wealthy citizens footing many of the bills as a form of tax known as liturgies. A single production could cost thousands of drachmas, a small fortune that could buy you a decent house or several hundred goats. Why spend so much? Because in Athens, being seen as a patron of the arts was a fast track to social clout. It was like getting your name on a building or sponsoring a cool indie festival today. And then there's the political angle. Athens in the 6th century BCE wasn't just the cradle of democracy, it was a hotbed of political maneuvering. Theatre was a tool, a loudspeaker for political messages hidden beneath the guise of entertainment. leaders quickly realized that controlling the narrative meant controlling the people. The plays often reflected current events, with playwrights like Aeschylus and Sophocles weaving in themes that resonated with the audience's everyday lives: war, politics, betrayal. These weren't just stories, they were commentaries wrapped in tragedy and comedy, played out in front of thousands in amphitheatres like the Theatre of Dionysus, which could seat around 17,000 spectators. Now, let's bust a myth or two. The romantic notion of theatre springing fully formed from religious rituals is a bit like crediting the Wright brothers with modern aviation. Yes, they got the first plane off the ground, but it took a village of engineers to build the jets we have today. Similarly, while the roots were religious, the branches flourished because of social and economic incentives. It wasn't just about honouring some god, but also about showcasing civic pride, boosting the local economy and, let's face it, outdoing the neighbouring city-states. Moreover, it wasn't all highbrow drama. The early iterations of theatre included bawdy performances and satyr plays, which were essentially ancient Greek stand-up comedy. Think slapstick humour with a side of social critique. The Greeks loved a good laugh as much as a good cry, and these performances often poked fun at well-known figures and events. It was a delicate balancing act, keeping the gods appeased while giving the audience what they really wanted, some good old-fashioned entertainment. So, while it's tempting to view the birth of Greek theatre as a purely sacred act, the reality is it was more akin to a shrewd business venture with a side of political activism. It was a microcosm of Greek society, a blend of the sacred and the profane, the personal and the political, all playing out under the open sky. And as the applause echoed through the amphitheatres, somewhere in the back, a wealthy patron was already counting the social capital earned from another successful show. As another successful show wrapped up under the starry Athenian sky, the wealthy patron, our ancient benefactor of culture, wasn't just basking in applause, he was also making mental notes about how his sponsorship would boost his social standing. You see, in ancient Greece, nothing screamed, "I've arrived," quite like being a Sheregos or theatrical sponsor. Forget getting your name on a library, this was where the real action was. Now, let's talk numbers. Because in the world of ancient Greek theatre, it wasn't just about the drama unfolding on stage, there was plenty of drama in the ledger books too. The costs of staging one of these theatrical extravaganzas were eye-watering. We're talking thousands of drachmas, and if you're wondering how much that was, think of it as akin to the price of several high-end Teslas in today's money. The state might chip in for part of the festivities, but the real financial heavy lifting was done by our horgwa. These guys weren't just signing checks, they were bankrolling the whole shebang, from costumes to chorus members and even the cost of training those members in dance and song. But why would anyone want to sink so much cash into something that offered no direct financial return? Here's where the rubber meets the road: prestige and influence. A successful production could catapult a choragos to new social heights. It was a masterstroke of self-promotion, wrapped in the guise of civic duty. And if this sounds a bit like throwing a lavish wedding to outdo your neighbour's shindig, you're not far off. And here's where the irony kicks in. While these plays were free for the public, providing a veneer of democratic access to culture, the reality was more like an exclusive club with an open-door policy. Sure, anyone could attend, but the content and nuance of these performances were shaped by the elite. The stories told, the themes explored, and the messages sent were all subtly, or not so subtly, filtered through the lens of those who held the purse strings. It was like tuning into a radio station that claimed to be for the people, but was really a mouthpiece for its sponsors. Theatre, therefore, became a clever tool for reinforcing social hierarchies. On the surface, it was about the art and the gods and the communal experience, but dig a little deeper, and you'll see it was as much about power, control, and status. The wealthy could reinforce their position in the social pecking order, while the audiences were fed narratives that often upheld the status quo. Even when plays dared to critique or satirize the powerful, they did so within a framework that ultimately reaffirmed societal norms. It was the ancient equivalent of a feel-good movie with a moral lesson that nobody really questioned. Let's not forget the playwrights and actors who were, in their way, the rock stars of their time. Sure, they didn't have Instagram followers or endorsement deals, but they had something better: public acclaim and the chance to shape public discourse. Yet, They, too, danced to the tune of those who funded them. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. These legendary names didn't just write plays, they navigated a complex web of patronage and politics, crafting stories that resonated with the masses while appeasing their elite sponsors. The amphitheatres themselves, like the Grand Theatre of Dionysus, were architectural marvels designed to impress and accommodate the masses. With seating for up to 17,000 people, these spaces were the ancient world's answer to the modern sports arena. But here's the kicker. Much like today's stadiums funded by billionaire team owners, these theatres stood as silent testaments to the influence of the wealthy. They were monuments to civic pride, yes, but also to personal legacy. As the plays unfolded, messages about war, morality, and politics echoed across the stone seats. The audience was swept up in tales of heroes and gods, their emotions manipulated by the clever use of dialogue and spectacle. But in the background, the whispers of power and control were ever present. It was a delicate dance between art and authority, entertainment and indoctrination. And so, while the public laughed and cried, the elite quietly shaped the cultural narrative, reinforcing their grip on society. It was a world where the illusion of choice masked the reality of control, where the chorus sang not just the lines of tragedy, but the unsung verses of power. As the night drew to a close, with the lingering echoes of applause fading into the Athenian air, the patrons would return to their homes, content in the knowledge that they had not just sponsored a play, but subtly steered the course of public thought. Now, as we leave the amphitheatre behind, remember, in the world of ancient Greek theatre, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. The masks may have changed, but the play, the intricate dance of art, power, and society, was timeless. Stay tuned, because there's more to this tale of drama and deception, and it's only just beginning to unfold. As we pivot from the theatrical spectacle to the stone and mortar that made it possible, let's talk about the Greek theatres themselves. Those grand architectural wonders that didn't just host dramas, but were dramas in their own right. Built into hillsides like some sort of ancient IMAX theatres without the popcorn, these venues were feats of engineering genius and occasional folly. First off, let's tackle the myth of architectural perfection. These theatres weren't handed down from Mount Olympus fully formed. No, they were born from a series of trial-and-error experiments, with some errors being as monumental as the structures themselves. Take the Theatre of Dionysus in Athens, the granddaddy of them all. It began as a rudimentary affair in the 6th century BCE, essentially a clearing with a few wooden benches. It evolved over time, but not without a few hiccups. For instance, there's good evidence that the stage collapsed in the 5th century BCE. Imagine that. Actors in the middle of a soliloquy suddenly finding themselves part of an unscheduled acrobatic act. The ancient Greeks were obsessed with acoustics, rightly so, since microphones were a few millennia away. Legendary architect and acoustician Vitruvius, think of him as the sound engineer of the ancient world, wrote extensively about how to design a theatre to carry a voice from the stage to the cheap seats without losing a single line of a complex Greek. Tragedy. The sloped seating, known as the theatron, wasn't just for a better view, it was all about channeling sound waves, and it worked, mostly. But it wasn't all science, there was plenty of guesswork involved too. Some theatres had notorious dead zones, areas where the dramatic cries of Oedipus would drop to a whisper, leaving the audience wondering if they'd missed some crucial plot twist. And let's not forget the audience. Because if you think getting a ticket to the latest Marvel movie is tough, try snagging a spot in a 17,000-seat theatre when half of Athens has the same idea. These theatres were the ancient world's social media, where people went not just to see and hear, but to be seen and heard. But here's the kicker, they weren't always comfortable. Stone seating meant you were sitting on rock-hard benches for hours, which makes the cushy chairs of our multiplexes seem downright luxurious. It was literally a pain in the backside, but hey, suffering for art has always been a thing. Then there's the question of audience capacity. Theatres like Epidaurus and Syracuse could hold up to 14,000 and 15,000 spectators respectively. But while these numbers are impressive, they came with logistical nightmares. Herding that many people in and out of a venue, especially when most of them had indulged in the wine-soaked revelry of the pre-show festivities, was no small feat. Traffic jams aren't a modern invention, folks. They just involved more togas and fewer honking horns back then. Speaking of togas, let's address the sartorial logistics. With all those people packed in, the potential for wardrobe malfunctions was as high as the terraces they sat upon. Theatres were lively places, full of chatter, spontaneous applause, and perhaps the odd catcall. Not exactly the hushed reverence we might expect from a theatre today. The Greeks embraced the chaos, maybe because they knew that real life was as unscripted and unpredictable as any comedy or tragedy they could stage. Now, while the romanticized image of these theatres is all about idyllic acoustics and architectural beauty, the reality was that these structures were subject to the whims of time and nature. Earthquakes, erosion, and plain old wear and tear meant constant repairs and renovations. It was less like maintaining a timeless monument and more like keeping a vintage car running, not just a question of aesthetics, but of survival. In fact, if you think about it, the real drama was not always on the stage. The construction and maintenance of these theatres were a testament to human ingenuity and folly. The ancients might have aimed for perfection, but they often landed somewhere between adequate and that'll do. Yet, despite the chaos and the occasional architectural misstep, these theatres stood the test of time. They were, after all, built not just of stone, but of ambition and a touch of hubris. As we continue to unravel the tapestry of ancient Greek theatre, remember that every stone seat and every acoustically imperfect stage tells a story. Each theatre was a living, breathing entity, as much a part of the performance as the actors and the plays. And while we might laugh at their logistical blunders, it's worth noting that these venues are still standing, still echoing with the voices of the past, inviting us to sit and listen to the tales they have to tell. So as we leave the theatre, the echoes of ancient applause still ringing in our ears, let's ponder the fact that history, much like a good play, is a blend of art and accident, perfection and imperfection. And as always, the show must go on. Stay tuned for more twists and turns in the saga of ancient Greek theatre. The curtain is far from closing. As we leave the theatre, the echoes of ancient applause still ringing in our ears, let's dive into the juicy content that filled these Greek stages. While the stones of the amphitheatres may have their own stories to tell, the plays themselves were where the real action happened. And we're not talking about your average bedtime stories here. These plays were the Netflix of ancient Greece, complete with drama, comedy, and a healthy dose of political intrigue. First up, we have tragedy, the genre that made audiences weep into their togas. Now, if you've ever had a rough week and decided to drown your sorrows in a tragic movie marathon, you might think you know what a tragedy is. But ancient Greek tragedies were something else entirely. They were less about personal woes and more about the big, existential questions. Think Sophocles, whose works often revolved around fate and the god's cruel sense of humour. His play, Oedipus Rex, for instance, wasn't just a family drama on steroids. It was a deep dive into the human condition, exploring themes of destiny and self-discovery. Talk about a plot twist. Oedipus blinds himself after realizing he's fulfilled a grim prophecy. That's the kind of ending that makes Game of Thrones look like a picnic. But let's not overlook comedy, the lighter side of Greek theatre, where playwrights like Aristophanes reign supreme. Aristophanes was the ancient world's answer to a satirical late-night host, using humour to poke fun at politicians and society. His plays, such as Lysistrata, were biting critiques wrapped in bawdy humour. In Lysistrata, the women of Greece unite to end the Peloponnesian War by withholding, well, let's just say they cut off a very basic male desire. That's right, sexual politics as a weapon for peace. Aristophanes didn't just make people laugh, he made them think, challenging societal norms with a wink and a nudge. Now, you might wonder how these playwrights got away with such bold commentary without ending up on the wrong side of a spear. The answer lies in their clever use of allegory and satire. By setting their stories in distant lands or mythical settings, they could critique contemporary politics and dodge the censors. It was a bit like wearing a mask, figuratively and literally, since Greek actors donned masks on stage to say things that would be risky to voice directly. This was the art of speaking truth to power, while keeping your head firmly attached to your shoulders. The political impact of these plays was no small potatoes. In a city-state like Athens, where the line between public life and theatre was as thin as a Spartan's patience, plays could sway public opinion. They were less about escapism and more about engagement. Take Aristophanes' The Clouds, which lampooned the philosopher Socrates and the intellectual trends of the time. It portrayed Socratic thinking as a cloud of confusion, not unlike what some folks might think of modern jargon-filled political speeches. The play was a critique of new ideas infiltrating traditional Athenian values, sparking debate and reflection among audiences. And let's not forget the economic angle. Producing these plays was a costly affair, but also a lucrative one for those involved. The playwrights, while not rolling in drachmas, gained fame and influence. Winning a theatrical competition at the city Dionysia could cement a playwright's status. It was the equivalent of an Oscar, complete with laurel wreaths instead of golden statuettes. For the actors, the stakes were high too. They performed not just for applause, but for potential sponsorships from the wealthy elite. Imagine landing a gig that could lead to your next big break, ancient style. But here's where we bust a myth, the notion that these plays were purely artistic endeavours. While they were undoubtedly masterpieces of literature, they were also tools of persuasion and propaganda. The state and wealthy patrons had a vested interest in the narratives being told. Plays often reinforced societal norms, subtly promoting the values of democracy, civic duty, and the Athenian way of life. Even when they critiqued society, they did so within a framework that ultimately supported the status quo. Think of it as the ancient version of a well-crafted political ad, entertaining, thought-provoking, and with a clear agenda. The plays, therefore, were a microcosm of Greek society, reflecting its complexities, contradictions, and aspirations. They were where art met life, and where life in turn inspired art. As audiences gathered in those grand theatres, they weren't just spectators, they were participants in a cultural dialogue shaped by the words and performances unfolding before them. So, as we imagine those ancient crowds dispersing after a day of theatrical delights, let's keep in mind that these plays were far more than mere entertainment. They were powerful instruments of change, cleverly crafted to inform, challenge, and inspire. They spoke to the heart of what it meant to be human, capturing the essence of Greek culture in all its glory and folly. Stay tuned as we continue this journey through the world of ancient Greek theatre. There's more drama, comedy, and intrigue to uncover, and the next act is just around the corner. The curtain may have fallen for today, but like all great stories, there's always another chapter waiting to be told. As the curtain falls on our epic exploration of ancient Greek theatre, let's pivot from history to legacy. It's easy to romanticize these ancient performances, seeing them as the pinnacle of cultural achievement, but the reality? Much messier. The ancient Greeks didn't just hand us the theatre on a silver platter, they threw it at us like a chaotic Pandora's box, full of both genius and folly. Now, their influence ripples through time, touching everything from Broadway to your local community stage. First off, let's talk about the enduring appeal of Greek tragedies and comedies. These plays are like the Shakespeare of the ancient world, timeless, universally relatable, and occasionally overquoted by people trying to sound intellectual at parties. But there's a reason we keep coming back to them. The themes of fate, power, love, and betrayal speak to the human condition in ways that are as relevant today as they were back then. When you watch a modern adaptation of Oedipus Rex, you're not just seeing a man unravel his own destiny, you're witnessing a narrative that questions the very nature of self-awareness and identity. Greek theatre isn't just ancient history, it's a mirror reflecting the timeless complexities of being human. Now, let's debunk a myth that these plays were solely highbrow affairs. Sure, Sophocles and Euripides churned out tragedies that would make even the hardest heart weep, but they weren't above a little spectacle. They understood the allure of drama, the kind that keeps you on the edge of your stone seat. These playwrights were the original masters of the plot twist, the cliffhanger, the dramatic irony, all the elements that make you binge-watch a series today. And let's not ignore Aristophanes, the ancient comedian who'd have thrived in the world of Twitter with his sharp satire. His work was less about lofty ideals and more about poking fun at the absurdities of life, something every era can relate to. So how did these ancient scripts survive the ravages of time? Simple answer, they were copy-pasted by monks during the Middle Ages like some sort of divine homework. These scribes, often cloistered in dimly lit rooms with nothing but a quill and a love for the classics, painstakingly preserved these works. Think of them as the original archivists, saving humanity's cultural gems one ink blot at a time. It's a good reminder that while history often favours the powerful, sometimes it's the humble scribes who preserve the stories that define us. Fast forward to modern times, and the echoes of ancient Greek theatre can be found everywhere you look. Take Broadway, for instance. The grand productions, the dramatic narratives, the occasional Greek chorus-style commentary, it's all there. Even the structure of modern plays owes a debt to the Greeks. Aristotle, in his Poetics, laid out the basics of dramatic structure, beginning, middle, end, that still guide playwrights today. It's like the ancient Greeks handed us the rule book for storytelling, and we've been scribbling in the margins ever since. And let's not forget the political undertones. Much like the ancient Athenians used theatre to comment on societal norms and politics, modern playwrights continue this tradition. From Arthur Miller's The Crucible, a critique of McCarthyism, to Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, a reimagining of American history, theatre remains a powerful tool for social commentary. It's a testament to the Greeks' legacy that theatre continues to challenge the status quo, to question authority, and to inspire change. Economically, theatre has transformed from a state-sponsored spectacle to a billion-dollar industry. But at its core, it still thrives on the same principles: storytelling, human connection, and a bit of showmanship. Ancient Greek patrons bankrolled these productions to gain social clout. Today, producers and investors do it for box office returns. The medium has evolved, but the motivations are strikingly similar: fame, influence, and a touch of vanity. Now, in the spirit of myth-busting, let's peel back the layers of romance surrounding these ancient performances. While it's tempting to picture amphitheatres filled with enraptured audiences hanging on every word, the reality was more complex. These were social events, complete with distractions, noise, and the occasional heckler. People attended to see and be seen, to gossip, and perhaps to catch up on the latest political drama. It was less about hushed reverence, and more akin to a lively town hall meeting with a side of entertainment. Yet, despite the chaos, or perhaps because of it, the magic of Greek theatre endures. It was a space where art met life, where stories transcended the confines of their time to speak to future generations. The Greeks gave us more than just plays. They gave us a legacy of creativity, innovation, and the unyielding human spirit. So the next time you find yourself at a theatre, whether it's a grand Broadway production or a cozy community play, remember that you're part of a tradition that stretches back millennia. A tradition that started with a ragtag group of Athenians honouring a god of wine and revelry, and grew into a cornerstone of cultural expression. The curtain may close, but the story, much like history itself, is always ready for the next act. And as we applaud the past, let's keep an eye on the future, because who knows what new narratives will emerge from the echoes of ancient applause. In the 17th century, a small, soggy nation with more windmills than a child's art project suddenly found itself at the centre of the world stage. This was the Dutch Republic, and its rise to power and wealth during what's now called the Dutch Golden Age is a story of commerce, innovation, and, yes, a fair amount of less than golden behaviour. So, how did this marshy backwater transform into an economic powerhouse? Well, gather round, because it's all about boats, spices, and a company that could give modern tech giants a run for their money: the Dutch East India Company, or VOC if you're into abbreviations. Let's start with the basics. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company was founded, and it wasn't your run-of-the-mill trading company. Oh no, this was the first multinational corporation in history, with a stock exchange and everything. To put this in perspective, imagine a business so massive that it had its own private army and navy, and you begin to get an idea of its might. The VOC didn't just trade spices like nutmeg and cloves, they practically monopolized them. At its peak, the company's ships crisscrossed the globe, hauling in profits that would make Jeff Bezos blush. In today's terms, we're talking about an annual revenue that could easily top 7 trillion. That's trillion with a T. But where there's money, there's power, and the Dutch were not shy about using theirs. The VOC was granted near-governmental powers, allowing it to mint coins, establish colonies, and negotiate treaties. Think of it as a corporate state's dream, or a libertarian nightmare, depending on your perspective. However, this was no free-market utopia. If a local ruler didn't want to play ball, the VOC was more than happy to send in the cannons. It's a bit like the mafia, but with better bookkeeping. Now, let's talk about why this mattered. The VOC turned the Netherlands into the world's financial centre, with Amsterdam as its beating heart. Picture a bustling city with canals instead of streets, and you're halfway there. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, established in 1602, was the first of its kind, allowing investors from all over Europe to buy and sell shares. This was capitalism on steroids, and it fueled an era of unprecedented prosperity. But here's where we need to put on our myth-busting hats. The Dutch Golden Age gets romanticized as a time of tolerance and enlightenment, where art thrived and tulips ruled supreme. And while it's true that this period saw the likes of Rembrandt and Vermeer, the reality is a bit more complicated. For starters, let's not confuse economic success with social justice. The Dutch were indeed more tolerant than some of their contemporaries. After all, they offered refuge to religious dissidents like the Pilgrims before they hopped on the Mayflower. But this so-called tolerance had its limits. The slave trade, for instance, was a dark undercurrent of their economic success. The Dutch West India Company, the VOC's not-so-nice sibling, was heavily involved in the transatlantic slave trade, transporting thousands of enslaved Africans to the Americas. Colonialism, too, was no walk in the tulip field. The Dutch Empire stretched from Indonesia to the Caribbean, and while we might imagine it as a quaint network of trading posts, it was built on exploitation. Indigenous populations were often subjugated or displaced to make room for plantations and trade routes. The Banda Islands, for instance, were the only place in the world where nutmeg grew, and the Dutch didn't exactly ask nicely to take over. In 1621, they massacred nearly the entire population to secure their monopoly, an event that was as brutal as it sounds. It's easy to get swept up in the romance of the Golden Age, with its paintings and prosperity, but it's crucial to remember the darker side. The wealth that flowed into the Netherlands wasn't just the result of savvy trading, it was built on the backs of those who were less fortunate. The Dutch may have been pioneers of global trade, but their legacy is a mixed bag of triumph and tragedy. So, as we marvel at the achievements of this era, let's not lose sight of the fact that behind the glittering surface were real human costs. The Dutch Golden Age was a time of remarkable progress, but it was also a period that reminds us how power and wealth can often come at a steep price. As we delve deeper into this fascinating period, keep in mind that the story of the Dutch Golden Age, like any golden tale, has its fair share of tarnish. But let's flip the canvas and focus on the art world that blossomed during this time, which was as vibrant as a Vermeer, yet as complex as a Rembrandt. The Dutch Golden Age wasn't just about spices and ships. It was a full-blown artistic explosion, with painters like Rembrandt van Rijn and Johannes Vermeer leading the charge. Their works are still hailed as masterpieces today, but let's not pretend that every 17th century Dutch household was dripping in oil paintings like some kind of bourgeois art gallery. First, a bit of context. The Netherlands was swimming in cash, thanks to all that trading prowess we talked about. And when people have money, they tend to spend it on nice things, art being one of the nicer ones. This was the era of the Golden Bend in Amsterdam, where wealthy merchants built opulent homes along the canals, and those homes needed decorating. Enter the artists, who suddenly found themselves in high demand. Here's where it gets interesting. While we love to romanticize the idea of every Dutch household having its very own Rembrandt, the reality is a bit more pedestrian. Art was a commodity, and like any commodity, it had its market. Sure, the rich were commissioning portraits and filling their salons with still lifes, but the average Dutch citizen wasn't exactly hanging a Vermeer in the loo. In fact, a lot of art was produced not for homes but for public spaces like guild halls and churches. And about those masterpieces, did you know that Rembrandt died penniless? Despite being one of the most celebrated artists of his time, he lacked the financial savvy of his merchant patrons. He lived large, collected art, and spent like he had a bottomless purse. But when the market crashed and commissions dried up, he was forced to declare bankruptcy in 1656. Not exactly the fairy tale ending we like to imagine. Speaking of fairy tales, let's not forget Johannes Vermeer, the man who somehow managed to paint with light long before Edison came along. Vermeer's work is the stuff of legend now, but back in the day, he was a bit of an enigma. He painted slowly, producing only about 36 canvases that we know of, and he wasn't exactly rolling in guilders either. When he died, his wife had to sell off his paintings and even their clothes to pay off debts. Romantic, right? But why were these artists struggling while the economy was booming? It's all about supply and demand. The art market was flooded with works, and not every piece was a masterpiece. There were thousands of painters in the Dutch Republic, and while the cream rose to the top, many were simply trying to make ends meet. Art was being churned out, not just for the elite, but for a burgeoning middle class that wanted a piece of the cultural pie. Landscapes, portraits, still lifes. These were the Instagram posts of their day, snapshots of life that were affordable and fashionable. And let's talk about those still lifes for a moment. You've seen them, tables laden with fruit and goblets, often with a skull or two thrown in for good measure. These paintings were more than just pretty pictures, they were loaded with symbolism. The Dutch had a thing for the concept of vanitas, a reminder of life's transience and the futility of worldly possessions. It's a bit like hanging a motivational poster in your office, but with more existential dread. The economic context here is crucial. The art boom was fueled by the same forces that drove the Dutch economy: trade, prosperity, and a bit of showing off. The rise of a wealthy merchant class meant there were more patrons looking to commission works, but it also meant more competition among artists. It was a buyer's market, and while some artists hit the jackpot, others struggled to find their footing. And then there's the myth of the art-loving Dutch citizen. We like to think of them as cultured connoisseurs, but the truth is, many were just following a trend. Art was a status symbol, a way to show off your wealth and taste. Much like today's designer handbags or luxury cars, having a piece of art was a way to keep up with the Joneses, or the Jansens, as it were. So, was the Dutch Golden Age truly a golden time for art? Yes and no. It was an era of incredible creativity and innovation, but it was also a time when art was a commodity like any other. The romantic notion of widespread artistic patronage is just that, a notion. The reality was more complex, shaped by economics and society in ways that remind us that even in the most glamorous of times, there's always a gritty underbelly. As we continue to explore this fascinating period, remember that the story of art during the Dutch Golden Age, like any good painting, has layers that reveal both beauty and blemish. It's a tale of triumphs and trials, of artists who became legends and those who faded into obscurity. And while the masterpieces of Rembrandt and Vermeer will always be celebrated, it's worth remembering that they were part of a much larger tapestry, one woven with both silk threads and rough burlap. So, after basking in the artistic glow of the Dutch Golden Age, it's time to step off the canvas and into the boardroom of the 17th century Dutch Republic. Now, don't worry, we're not about to dive into the dull details of parliamentary procedures. Instead, let's pull back the curtain on a political system that was as innovative as it was chaotic. A decentralized power structure that could make even a modern-day bureaucracy blush. At the heart of this political marvel was the Dutch Republic, or the United Provinces, to give it its Sunday name. Imagine a nation run like a confederation of city-states, each with its own set of rules, leaders, and a penchant for doing things their own way. It was like a political potluck, where everyone brought their own dish, and sometimes the flavours didn't exactly blend harmoniously. The Dutch Republic was made up of 7 provinces, with Holland being the undisputed heavyweight. Think of it as the big sibling who always gets the front seat in the car. Within this system, power was famously decentralized, with each province maintaining a fair amount of autonomy. This setup was both the Republic's secret sauce and its Achilles heel. On the one hand, it allowed for a level of local governance that could adapt quickly to change. On the other hand, it was a breeding ground for infighting and rivalries that could make a reality TV show look tame. At the top of this slightly wobbly pyramid was the States General, a sort of federal assembly that convened in The Hague. Picture it as the United Nations of Dutch provinces, where representatives haggled over everything from military campaigns to taxation while sipping on their morning coffee. The real kicker? Decisions required unanimous consent. Yes, you heard that right, unanimous. If this sounds like a recipe for gridlock, you'd be spot on. Getting 7 provinces to agree on anything was like herding cats, especially when those cats had a penchant for independence and the occasional spat. Enter the stadtholder, a position that was part leader, part figurehead, and all about walking a political tightrope. The role of stadtholder was often filled by a member of the House of Orange, a noble family with a knack for staying in power even when their actual power was more symbolic than practical. Picture a monarch without the crown or the absolute authority, a ceremonial dignitary who, at times, could wield significant influence, particularly in military matters. But let's not romanticize their power too much. The stadholder's authority waxed and waned like the North Sea tides, depending on the political climate and the whims of the provinces. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds like a hot mess. And you'd be right, but here's the twist. This decentralized chaos was also a breeding ground for innovation. Without a single autocratic ruler dictating every move, provinces could experiment with new ideas and policies. This flexibility was crucial in a rapidly changing world where trade winds and political alliances could shift overnight. However, the decentralized structure also bred a fair amount of backstabbing and political maneuvering. Provinces often prioritized local interests over national unity, which led to a constant tug-of-war over resources and policies. It was a bit like a family dinner, where everyone's vying for the last piece of pie, but on a much grander and more consequential scale. Despite the Republic's reputation for freedom and tolerance, let's not forget that this was a society with its own set of rigid class structures. The merchant class may have been the new aristocracy, but that didn't mean everyone was invited to the party. The gap between the wealthy elite and the working class was as wide as the Amsterdam canals, and social mobility was more of an aspiration than a reality for most. For all its talk of liberty, the Dutch Republic was no egalitarian paradise. The oligarchies that controlled the cities were often closed circles, where power was passed down like a family heirloom. The regents, or ruling class, were a tight-knit group who held the reins of power and rarely let outsiders in. These were the merchant princes, the ones who wore lace collars and fur-trimmed robes while making decisions that would impact the entire republic. And let's not sugarcoat the so-called freedom of the press either. Sure, the Dutch prided themselves on being more open-minded than, say, the Spanish Inquisition, but censorship was still very much a tool in the political toolbox. The authorities kept a close eye on publications, and anything deemed too seditious or blasphemous could land you in hot water. Freedom, it seems, had its boundaries, and crossing them could be a costly mistake. So, while the Dutch Golden Age is often painted as a utopia of enlightenment and liberty, the reality was a bit more nuanced. The decentralized power structure allowed for remarkable flexibility and innovation, but it also sowed the seeds of discord and class division. It's a tale of contrasts and contradictions, where the same system that fostered progress could also stifle it. As we continue to unravel the intricacies of the Dutch Golden Age, remember that this glittering period in history was not without its shadows. The Republic's political setup was as much a story of human ingenuity as it was of human folly, a reminder that even in times of great achievement, the struggle for power and equality remains a timeless saga. Stay tuned as we explore more of this fascinating era, where the next chapter promises to delve deeper into the social fabric and economic machinations that shaped the Dutch Republic. Now, as we pivot from the bustling art markets and political quagmires of the Dutch Golden Age, let's set sail into the realm of scientific breakthroughs and maritime innovations that were as revolutionary as they were, at times, a bit wacky. Picture 17th century Holland, land of tulips, trade, and telescopes, where the quest for knowledge was the ultimate treasure hunt, and the scientists were the rock stars. And speaking of rock stars, let's spotlight Christiaan Huygens, a name that might not roll off the tongue as easily as Rembrandt, but it should. This guy was the Einstein before Einstein, a polymath who dabbled in everything from mathematics to astronomy. His most notable invention? The pendulum clock in 1656. Think of it as the Rolex of its day, except it wasn't just about style. Huygens's clock was a game-changer, bringing precision to timekeeping that was essential for navigation. You see, before Huygens, sailors were more or less guessing their longitude at sea, a risky business when your livelihood depended on hitting the right spice island and not just wandering aimlessly in the ocean. Then there's Antony van Leeuwenhoek, a man who took the phrase "looking closely" to a whole new level. Armed with nothing more than handcrafted microscopes, this self-taught scientist peered into drops of water and uncovered a hidden world of animalcules, or, as we call them, microorganisms. This was the 1670s, folks, long before anyone had an inkling that bacteria were a thing. Leeuwenhoek's discoveries were so groundbreaking that he practically invented the field of microbiology. Imagine the shock and awe of realizing there's an entire universe in a single drop of water. Talk about finding Nemo. But here's the kicker. Despite these scientific strides, the world was still neck-deep in superstition. While Huygens was refining the laws of motion, the average person was more concerned with the humours in their body or the alignment of the stars. This was a time when science and superstition waltzed awkwardly together, each trying to lead. It's a bit like watching a modern-day debate on climate change facts on one side, denial on the other. The Dutch obsession with precision didn't stop at clocks and microscopes. Their shipbuilders were artisans of the sea, crafting vessels like the Fluid, a sleek three-masted ship that was the Tesla of its time, efficient, fast, and designed purely for trade. The Fluid could carry twice the cargo with half the crew compared to its predecessors. This wasn't just about aesthetics, it was economic genius. The Dutch knew that fewer sailors meant less payroll and more cargo meant more profit. It's the kind of efficiency that would make even the most ruthless corporate CFO nod approvingly. In the age of exploration, these innovations were the fuel that powered the Dutch to global prominence. Trade routes were like the fibre optic cables of their time, connecting the world and transmitting wealth and ideas at a dizzying pace. The ability to navigate accurately, thanks to Huygens's clocks, and to communicate discoveries, thanks to Leeuwenhoek's microscopes, turned the Netherlands into a hub of intellectual and commercial activity. Yet, as we marvel at their scientific prowess, let's not forget the grim realities that lurked beneath the surface. The pursuit of knowledge was often entangled with the pursuit of profit, and the line between exploration and exploitation was as thin as a Leeuwenhoek slide. The same ships that brought back exotic spices and scientific specimens also transported human cargo in chains, a stark reminder that the golden glow of this age was often tarnished with human suffering. Despite their advancements, the Dutch couldn't entirely escape the clutches of medieval thinking. Witch trials were still a thing, and the public's fascination with the occult was rivaled only by its appetite for herring. It's a bittersweet irony that the same society that birthed pioneers of the scientific revolution also feared the wrath of witches. But isn't that the crux of human nature? To advance and regress, to enlighten and mystify, all in the same breath? As we look at the legacy of the Dutch Golden Age, it's clear that the story is as complex as the intricate gears of Huygens's clock. The Dutch weren't just traders or artists. They were innovators who helped lay the groundwork for the modern world, even as they wrestled with the shadows of their past. The era was a testament to the heights of human achievement and the depths of human folly, a duality that continues to shape our present. So, while we celebrate their achievements, let's not lose sight of the bigger picture. The Dutch Golden Age was a kaleidoscope of contradictions, where progress and prejudice, science and superstition all coexisted in a delicate balance. And as we continue this journey through history, remember that each discovery, each innovation, was not just a step forward, but also a reflection of the complex tapestry of human endeavour. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into the social and economic currents that flowed beneath this fascinating era, currents that carried the Dutch to both glory and infamy. And so, while the Dutch sailed the high seas of innovation, they were, unbeknownst to them, also steering toward the rocky shores of decline. The Dutch Golden Age didn't end with a bang, but more of a prolonged sigh, one that echoed through the canals of Amsterdam and the halls of power across the provinces. So, what went wrong? How did this mighty maritime empire, this bastion of trade and culture, start to unravel like an old tapestry? Let's dive into the gritty details of economic competition and military quagmires that helped bring down the curtain on this golden era. First off, let's talk about economic competition, the silent killer of many a golden dream. By the late 17th century, the Dutch weren't the only game in town. The English and the French, not exactly known for their love of tulips or tolerance, were catching up fast. England, in particular, was flexing its naval muscles in a way that would make even Poseidon do a double take. The Navigation Acts, starting in 1651, were a series of laws that restricted Dutch ships from carrying goods to England or its colonies. Suddenly, the Dutch found themselves locked out of lucrative markets, and their ships, no matter how well crafted, couldn't bypass regulations. Then there was the little matter of military conflicts. War. that expensive hobby of kings and nations, took its toll on the Dutch. The Anglo-Dutch Wars, 4 of them between 1652 and 784, were like a never-ending boxing match where both sides were bruised but still standing. The Dutch Republic, with its decentralized government, wasn't exactly built for swift military action. Decision-making was like trying to organize a surprise party with a committee. Good luck with that. The cost of these wars bled the treasury dry, and the financial strain was palpable. And let's not forget the French. Louis XIV, the Sun King, didn't just want to tan under the European sun, he wanted to rule it. The Franco-Dutch War from 1672 to 1678 was a nightmare for the Dutch. Known as the Rampjaar, or disaster year of 1672, the French invasion was a wake-up call that the sun might be setting on Dutch dominance. The Dutch managed to hold their own, largely thanks to flooding their own lands. Take that, invaders! But the damage was done. Economic prosperity was hard to maintain when your fields were underwater and your neighbours were plotting your downfall. Now, we can't talk about the decline without addressing the VOC, our old friend the Dutch East India Company. By the late 17th century, the VOC was a bloated behemoth struggling under its own weight. Corruption was rife, and inefficiency was the order of the day. It was a classic case of biting off more than one could chew, or in this case, more than one could ship. The company's monopoly on spices was slipping, and new competition from the British East India Company was a thorny issue. The VOC's decline was symptomatic of the larger systemic issues. Too big to fail, yet fail it did. But let's not throw out the baby with the brackish canal water. Despite its decline, the Dutch Golden Age left an indelible mark on the world. Economically, it laid the groundwork for modern capitalism. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange had pioneered the concept of a financial market, and the idea of a multinational corporation was firmly planted in the world's consciousness. The Dutch showed the world how to do business on a global scale, and that lesson was not easily forgotten. Culturally, the legacy was just as profound. The art, the science, the architecture. These were not mere footnotes in history, but entire chapters. The masterpieces of Rembrandt and Vermeer still draw crowds, and the scientific discoveries of Huygens and Leeuwenhoek set the stage for the Enlightenment. The canals of Amsterdam, those watery thoroughfares, remain a testament to Dutch ingenuity and urban planning. Yet, for all the romanticism, the era was also a reminder of the darker side of human ambition. The wealth of the Golden Age was built on the backs of colonies and the exploitation of resources and people. The Dutch colonial empire, with its plantations and slave trade, was a brutal enterprise. The legacy of colonialism is a scar that history must acknowledge, a reminder that the pursuit of profit often came at an unforgivable human cost. And then there's the social inequality. The Dutch Republic, for all its talk of tolerance, was a strictly hierarchical society. The merchant elite ruled the roost, and the gap between rich and poor was as wide as the Zuiderzee. Social mobility was more myth than reality, a mirage that shimmered tantalizingly but was out of reach for most. It was a society where the regents lived in opulence while the working class toiled in obscurity. So, what do we make of this Golden Age, this period of triumph and tragedy? It was an era of contradictions, of light and shadow. It was a time when the Dutch Republic reached for the stars, even as it struggled with the weight of its own ambitions. The Golden Age was a reminder that progress often comes with a price, and that the pursuit of greatness can be both noble and destructive. As we close the book on the Dutch Golden Age, let's carry forward its lessons. Let's celebrate the art, the science, the daring spirit of exploration, but let's also remember the human cost, the inequalities, and the exploitation. The Dutch Golden Age was a dazzling chapter in the story of humanity, but one that also cautions us about the perils of unchecked ambition. It's a story that invites us to reflect on the dual nature of progress, to strive for the betterment of all, and to acknowledge the shadows in our history as we forge a brighter future. And there you have it, folks. The Dutch Golden Age, a period of brilliance and blemish, a time when the Netherlands lit up the world stage, only to find its light dimmed by the very forces it helped unleash. History, like life, is never black and white, but a tapestry of colours, a complex interplay of forces that shape our world. As we sail away from this era, let's keep the lessons of the past close to our hearts as we navigate our own uncertain future. In the swirling dust, of early human civilization, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers decided to crisscross through modern-day Iraq. The ancient Mesopotamians were busy laying down the groundwork for something that would outlast their wildest expectations: writing. But before you start picturing soulful poets scribbling down the epic tales of yore, let's pull the brakes on that romantic train. The first scribes of cuneiform weren't exactly crafting tales of love and heroism. They were more the ancient version of number-crunching accountants. That's right, the origins of writing, around 3400 BCE, were less about waxing lyrical and more about tallying sheep and figuring out how much barley was enough to avoid a Sumerian IRS audit. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wasn't cuneiform the first writing system? Well, that's a myth with legs longer than a Mesopotamian cylinder seal, and it's time to chop it down to size. Sure, cuneiform is one of the oldest writing systems we know, but let's not forget the Egyptian hieroglyphics and the proto-writing systems in places like ancient China. They were all trying their hand at recording human chaos in their own special ways. But cuneiform? It took the cake for being incredibly practical and annoyingly complex. These ancient scribes weren't messing around. They used a stylus, a pointy reed tool to press wedge-shaped marks into wet clay tablets. The result? A script that looks like a tiny army of little arrows marching across a muddy battlefield. The real kicker here is that the first cuneiform tablets were essentially ancient spreadsheets. Forget sonnets, think more along the lines of Inventory of Goats, 3400 BCE edition. These clay tablets were the stocktake records of bustling Mesopotamian cities like Uruk, where the economy was as critical as the sun rising in the east. In a society where agriculture was the bread and butter, literally, keeping tabs on your resources was paramount. It's like they say, you can't run an empire on vibes alone. And speaking of clay tablets, let's talk about the practicalities. Imagine lugging around a chunk of mud that's essentially the size of a large book. It wasn't like you could tuck it into your toga pocket and call it a day. And yet, somehow, these bulky tablets were the backbone of Mesopotamian bureaucracy. The ancients weren't writing for posterity, they were writing for survival. Each tablet was a testament to the agricultural and economic engine that powered these early cities. You needed to know who owed what to whom, or who had the fattest sheep, because in a barter economy, ignorance wasn't bliss, it was bankruptcy. The economic context here is a fascinating tapestry of necessity driving innovation. Picture a society where your wealth wasn't measured in coins, but in livestock and grain. The Mesopotamians were pioneers of proto-capitalism, and cuneiform was their ledger. This wasn't some leisurely academic pursuit, it was life or death. The Sumerians might have had their heads in the stars, but their feet were firmly planted in the mud, both literally and figuratively. They needed a way to keep track of everything: crops, trades, taxes, because in those days, losing track of a few bushels of barley was akin to losing an entire year's worth of Netflix subscriptions. And let's not forget the stylus, that humble tool of the trade. It was made from a reed, a common plant along the riverbanks. This was the ancient world's version of a ballpoint pen, except a lot less reliable and infinitely more cumbersome. The stylus had a triangular tip, perfect for creating the iconic wedge-shaped marks that defined cuneiform. It wasn't glamorous, but it got the job done. In a world without digital backups or cloud storage, the clay tablet and stylus were as close to cutting-edge technology as you could get. Cuneiform writing was less about artistic expression and more about the nitty-gritty of daily life. It was born out of the necessity to organize and control, to administer and manage. The Mesopotamians were essentially building the framework of civilization with each stroke of their stylus. This was the dawn of recorded history, not because they wanted to be remembered, but because they needed to remember. And so, amid the hustle and bustle of ancient city life, where the sound of scribes scratching away at their clay tablets was as common as the bleating of sheep, writing took its first tentative steps into the world. It was a leap not into the arms of literature, but into the grips of administration and economy. The Mesopotamians might not have set out to change the world, but by simply keeping track of their grain, they did just that. From those first tentative scratches in the mud, cuneiform would evolve like a complex Rube Goldberg machine, each iteration adding layers of complexity to the straightforward task of not going bankrupt. At first, it was all about pictographs, simple images representing objects. Think of a stick figure sheep for, well, a sheep. But as anyone who's ever tried to draw a decent stick figure can tell you, simplicity is not always a virtue. As city-states began sprouting like weeds along the Fertile Crescent, the scribes had their hands full trying to keep up with the demands of an increasingly complex society. Suddenly, a sheep wasn't just a sheep, it was a measure of wealth, a dowry, a temple offering. And so that humble pictograph had to grow up and get a job. Enter the age of abstract symbols. This evolution wasn't just a scribal whimsy, it was a necessity driven by the messy realities of urban life. When your city-state is essentially a bustling metropolis by ancient standards, you need a way to handle more than just livestock inventory. You need to track legal transactions, property ownership, and, inevitably, disputes over that one neighbour who always borrows your oxen. The scribes expanded their toolkit, developing new symbols to capture the nuances of human interaction. They started stringing together multiple pictographs to represent abstract concepts. You could say they were the original emoji creators, except with fewer cat faces and more dire economic implications. Now, let's talk about the scribes themselves. Before you start imagining them as the rock stars of the ancient world, hailed for their intellectual prowess and poetic insights, let's hit pause on that fantasy. In reality, these scribes were more like your run-of-the-mill office clerks, buried under a mountain of clay tablets with mind-numbing records to keep. Sure, they received training in the prestigious scribal schools, but their curriculum wasn't exactly filled with creative writing courses. It focused on practical skills, arithmetic, record-keeping, and the all-important art of making sure nobody's taxes went astray. They weren't revered intellectuals, they were bureaucratic functionaries, the cogs in the administrative machinery of their time. But don't let that revelation dull the romance entirely. The idea of a scribe as a mystical figure, a keeper of secrets and wisdom, has its own allure. After all, they did wield the power of the written word in a world where most people were as literate as a sack of barley. Yet, the truth is, these scribes were more likely to be sweating over tax ledgers than composing epic poetry. Their job was to ensure the smooth operation of the city-state's economy, not to ponder the meaning of life. In a way, they were the unsung heroes of their time, ensuring that society didn't collapse under the weight of its own disorganization. As cuneiform continued its evolution, it became a tool not just for economic management, but for political control. The rise of city-states like Uruk, Ur, and Lagash required a means to enforce laws and agreements. Enter the legal codes. The most famous of these is the Code of Hammurabi, a Babylonian masterpiece of jurisprudence carved into a 7-foot stone stele. This wasn't just any rock, mind you. It was a public display of power, a proclamation that the king's word was law, etched into eternity. And who do you think got the delightful job of chiseling away at that stone? You guessed it, our trusty scribes. These legal codes were more than just a set of rules. They were a way to legitimize authority and maintain order in an ever-growing society. They addressed everything from property rights to the proper punishment for theft, which often involved a hefty dose of eye for an eye justice. The cuneiform script was adaptable enough to capture the nuances of these laws, ensuring they were accessible to those who mattered, namely, the ruling class and the scribes themselves. For the average Mesopotamian, understanding the intricacies of these codes was probably as likely as deciphering the fine print on an insurance policy today. So, while the idea of scribes as revered intellectuals might crumble under scrutiny, the impact of their work was nothing short of monumental. They weren't just keeping tabs on who owed what, they were laying down the tracks for the train of civilization to chug along. With each wedge-shaped mark, they were building the infrastructure of governance, economy, and society. And as the city-states grew in power and complexity, so too did the script. It became a symbol of authority, a tool of administration, and a testament to human ingenuity. In the grand scheme of history, cuneiform is a testament to the human desire to organize and control the chaos of life. It's a reminder that, while we may romanticize the past, the reality was often far more gritty and pragmatic. The scribes of Mesopotamia weren't crafting grand narratives. They were ensuring that the wheels of civilization kept turning. They were the unsung heroes of the ancient world, armed with styluses and clay tablets, shaping history one wedge at a time. As we continue this journey through the evolution of writing, let's remember to tip our hats to those ancient scribes who slogged through the administrative drudgery so that we could one day marvel at their accomplishments. They may not have been the poets of their era, but their legacy is etched in the very foundations of history itself. And as cuneiform continued to evolve, it would pave the way for new forms of communication, new ways of thinking, and ultimately new worlds to explore. But that's a story for another time. For now, let's leave our scribes to their labours and prepare to delve deeper into the world they helped create. As the scribes of Mesopotamia toiled away, crafting those iconic wedge-shaped marks into clay, something fascinating was happening. Cuneiform was spreading its metaphorical wings, flying beyond the borders of its Sumerian birthplace. This script, born from a need to track barley and sheep, was about to become the ancient world's version of a universal translator. Forget Google Translate. Cuneiform was the diplomatic lingua franca that kept empires communicating. Now, let's dive into the nitty-gritty of this linguistic odyssey. By the time the Assyrians, Babylonians, and even the Hittites got their hands on cuneiform, it was like they'd been given the keys to the kingdom. Imagine it as the medieval Latin of the ancient Near East. If you wanted to get anything done, trade agreements, political treaties, marriage alliances, you needed to know your way around a clay tablet. The Assyrians, those masters of empire building, wielded cuneiform like a bureaucratic sledgehammer. With cities like Nineveh and Ashur at the heart of their domain, they used the script to issue decrees and record the glories of their conquests, ensuring their power was as indelible as the marks on clay. Meanwhile, the Babylonians, with their famed city of Babylon, were no slouches either. Under the reign of Hammurabi, they took the art of lawmaking to new heights, as we saw with that rock-solid code of Hammurabi. But beyond laws, cuneiform was also the language of commerce and science. Babylonian astronomers charted the skies, recording celestial phenomena with a precision that would make NASA blush, all in those trusty wedge-shaped symbols. And then there were the Hittites, the wild card of the ancient world. Hailing from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, these folks weren't about to reinvent the wheel or the stylus when they could just borrow it. They adopted cuneiform for their own purposes, crafting treaties and correspondences that connected them with the wider Near East. It was like an ancient LinkedIn, helping them network across cultures and regions. But here's where things get messy. While cuneiform was a common script, it wasn't a one-size-fits-all deal. Each culture had its own language and, let's be honest, nobody was winning any awards for user-friendliness. Learning cuneiform was the ancient equivalent of mastering a complex programming language, and not everyone was up to the task. The script itself was a labyrinth of symbols, over 600 of them to be exact, with each wedge carrying multiple meanings depending on context. It was no simple alphabet, it was an intricate dance of syllables, sounds, and symbols that required years of training to decode. If you thought learning Klingon was tricky, try wrapping your head around cuneiform. Scribes spent years in rigorous training, and the dropout rate was probably sky-high. These weren't just writing classes, they were grueling boot camps for the mind. Imagine memorizing hundreds of symbols, each with its own quirks and exceptions, like the world's most unforgiving spelling bee. That's right, ancient Mesopotamian scribal schools were churning out polyglots by necessity, not choice. Yet, despite these hurdles, cuneiform thrived. It was the glue that held the intricate web of ancient diplomacy together. Picture the Amana letters, a stash of clay tablets that serve as a window into the diplomatic correspondences between the Egyptian pharaohs and their Near Eastern counterparts. Written in Akkadian, one of the many languages rendered in cuneiform, these tablets are like ancient emails, full of negotiations, complaints, and royal gossip. They show us how cuneiform was the bridge over the language chasm, allowing diverse cultures to hash out their differences without resorting to swordplay. But let's not sugarcoat it. The language barrier was real, and it was formidable. For every successful exchange, there were probably a dozen lost in translation. Imagine a Hittite envoy trying to decipher a Babylonian tablet, scratching their head as they ponder whether they're supposed to send grain or gold. The complexity of cuneiform was both its strength and its Achilles heel, a testament to human ingenuity and stubbornness in equal measure. And so, as cuneiform spread like wildfire across the ancient world, it left its mark on history. It was more than just a writing system. It was a testament to the power of communication and the relentless drive to connect. Sure, it was complex, cumbersome, and sometimes downright baffling, but it was also the thread that wove together the tapestry of ancient civilization. This was a world where words held power, where the stroke of a stylus could seal a deal or spark a war. In the end, the story of Cuneiform is one of adaptation and resilience. It was a script that refused to be confined to its origins, evolving and spreading to meet the needs of a changing world. From the bustling streets of Babylon to the distant outposts of the Hittite Empire, Cuneiform was the silent witness to the rise and fall of empires. It was the language of kings and commoners, scholars and scribes, a testament to the human capacity for innovation and collaboration. As we continue to unravel the mysteries of Cuneiform, let's appreciate the grit and genius of those ancient scribes who, with their styluses poised and clay tablets ready, dared to etch the story of humanity into the annals of time. They were the unsung heroes of a bygone era, leaving a legacy that would echo through the ages long after their cities had crumbled to dust. And as we prepare to delve deeper into the world they helped shape, let's keep in mind that while the tools of communication may have changed, the desire to connect remains as strong as ever. And while the scribes etched their legacy into clay, the world around them was shifting like sand dunes in a desert storm. By around 1000 BCE, Cuneiform's glory days were numbered, and it wasn't just because people were tired of lugging around clay tablets as heavy as their life savings. You see, in the grand mosaic of history, change is the only constant, and Cuneiform was about to face some serious competition. First stop, Phoenicia, land of cedar ships and savvy traders who were about to give the world a linguistic makeover. The Phoenicians, bless their practical hearts, introduced an alphabetic system that was as revolutionary as sliced bread at a medieval feast. Instead of hundreds of complex symbols that made cuneiform scribes break into a cold sweat, the Phoenician alphabet got the job done with a sleek set of 22 characters. Think of it as the minimalist chic of ancient scripts, perfect for the busy merchant who needed to jot down trade deals faster than you can say Byblos. This newfangled writing system wasn't just easier on the eyes, it was a game-changer for literacy. Suddenly, you didn't need years of training to decipher a message. The average Joe, or should we say, the average Eliezer, could learn to read and write without needing a doctorate in deciphering wedges. And as literacy rates crept upward like a determined vine, societies that adopted alphabets could communicate more efficiently, leaving cuneiform to gather dust in the annals of history. If cuneiform was the ancient world's version of an old-school rotary phone, the Phoenician alphabet was the brand-new smartphone everyone wanted in their pockets. But let's not put all the blame on the Phoenicians. The decline of cuneiform was also a tale of shifting power dynamics and economic upheaval. As empires rose and fell faster than you could say Mesopotamian soap opera, the political landscape was anything but stable. The mighty Assyrian Empire, with its penchant for conquering neighbors before breakfast, eventually saw its influence wane. As Assyria's grip loosened, so did the necessity for its bureaucratic language. Meanwhile, Babylon, once the jewel of the ancient world, faced its own set of challenges, with new powers like Persia entering the scene, each with its own linguistic preferences. And let's talk economics, because nothing says change quite like a collapsing economy. Mesopotamia's trade routes, the lifeblood of its prosperity, were no longer the only game in town. New maritime routes across the Mediterranean were opening up faster than you could say Phoenician fleet, and with them came new trade partners, new cultures, and new languages. Suddenly, being the cuneiform kingpin seemed about as useful as a chocolate teapot. The writing was quite literally on the wall, or rather, the tablet. In this whirlwind of change, technological advancements also played their part. The invention of papyrus and, later, parchment offered lighter, more portable writing surfaces than clay. Why lug around a weighty tablet when you could carry a scroll that fits snugly under your arm? It was the ancient equivalent of swapping out your desktop for a laptop. The flexibility of these new materials made them perfect for the fast-paced demands of trade and communication. If clay tablets were the trusty old workhorse, papyrus was the new thoroughbred, galloping into the future with gusto. Now, before we start writing cuneiform's obituary, let's not forget that it hung on for quite a while, refusing to go gently into that good night. Even as alphabets gained ground, cuneiform remained the language of the learned, the script of scholars who still believed in the old ways. It was like the vinyl record of the ancient world, overtaken by new technology, but cherished by purists who loved its authenticity. But in the end, progress waits for no one, and by the time the Persian Empire came into full swing, cuneiform was already a relic of a bygone age. The Persians, with their knack for administration, adopted Aramaic as the lingua franca of their empire, a language that, surprise, surprise, used an alphabetic script. It was efficient, adaptable, and, most importantly, easy to learn. For cuneiform, it was the final nail in the clay coffin. And so, as the sun set on the era of wedge-shaped marks, a new dawn of communication was rising. The alphabetic systems, with their simplicity and versatility, were poised to conquer the world. They would pave the way for the Greek and Latin alphabets, the building blocks of countless modern languages. The scribes who once toiled over clay tablets would be replaced by a new generation of writers, but their legacy was undeniable. They had laid the groundwork for the written word, and in doing so, they had changed history. The decline of cuneiform was not just the end of an era, it was the beginning of a new chapter in human communication. It was a testament to the ever-evolving nature of language and the unstoppable march of progress. And while we might mourn the loss of those intricate symbols, we must also celebrate the new possibilities they gave rise to. For in the end, it is not the medium that matters, but the message, the stories, the ideas, the connections that bind us together across time and space. As we prepare to explore the next stage of this journey, let's remember that history is a tapestry woven from countless threads, each one a story waiting to be told. And as we unravel the tale of cuneiform's decline, let's keep our eyes on the horizon, eager to discover what lies beyond the next page of this ancient story. As we unravel the tale of cuneiform's decline, let's keep our eyes on the horizon, eager to discover what lies beyond the next page of this ancient story. So, what happens after the clay tablets are shelved next to the ancient equivalent of Betamax tapes? Well, cuneiform's legacy is a bit like that of a retired rock star. It might not be topping the charts anymore, but its influence echoes through history, leaving an indelible mark on our understanding of ancient civilizations. Now, before we wax poetic about the legacy of those wedge-shaped marks, let's acknowledge the practicalities. Cuneiform wasn't just a dusty relic buried under layers of ancient bureaucracy. It was the Rosetta Stone of the ancient Near East, a key that unlocked the secrets of civilizations long buried under the sands of time. When Sir Henry Rawlinson, a British Army officer with a penchant for cliffside adventures, deciphered the Behistun inscription in the 19th century, he wasn't just indulging a hobby, he was cracking open a time capsule. This trilingual inscription, carved into a limestone cliff in modern-day Iran, was the ancient world's version of a multilingual help desk, providing Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian texts. It was like finding the ultimate cheat sheet for ancient languages, allowing scholars to unravel the mysteries of cuneiform script and, by extension, the rich tapestry of Mesopotamian history. But cuneiform's legacy isn't just academic. It's a peculiar cultural touchstone that occasionally pops up in the most unexpected places. Think about pop culture references. Cuneiform has made cameo appearances that would make any ancient scribe raise a bemused eyebrow. The 1970s cult classic, The Exorcist, had its share of terrifying moments, but who knew it would feature a Mesopotamian demon named Pazuzu, whose origins were etched into the clay tablets of yore. It's like those scribes had a side gig writing horror scripts millennia before the genre was cool. And let's not forget the modern-day fascination with all things ancient. Cuneiform has become the subject of countless memes, turning those cryptic symbols into fodder for internet humor. It's like the ancient world meets the digital age, where a tablet no longer refers to a hunk of clay, but to the device you're probably reading this on. It's a quirky testament to the enduring allure of the past, proving that even the most archaic of scripts can find new life in the unlikeliest of places. So, what does this all say about the power of writing systems? Well, it's a bit like comparing a quill to a computer keyboard. Each writing system, whether it's the cumbersome cuneiform or the streamlined alphabet, shapes the societies that use them. They're not just tools of communication. They're frameworks that define how cultures think, trade, govern, and record their legacies. Cuneiform was the bedrock upon which Mesopotamian civilization was built, shaping everything from economic transactions to epic poetry, even if the latter was more of an afterthought. Writing systems are the unsung architects of human history. They record the triumphs and failures of empires, the minutiae of daily life, and the grand narratives that define civilizations. A society's writing system can reveal as much about its values and priorities as its monumental architecture or its most celebrated leaders. Cuneiform was a script of survival, born from necessity, yet it evolved into something far greater, a testament to human ingenuity and adaptability. As you ponder the legacy of cuneiform, consider the broader implications of the written word. It's an enduring symbol of humanity's quest to make sense of the chaos around us, to impose order on the unruly tapestry of existence. Writing isn't just about recording facts. It's about shaping reality, preserving knowledge, and connecting across time and space. Whether it's etched into clay, scrawled on parchment, or typed out in pixels, the written word is humanity's bridge across the ages. In the end, Cuneiform's story is one of evolution and resilience, a reminder that while the tools of communication may change, the drive to connect, record, and remember remains constant. So, next time you jot down a note or type out a message, spare a thought for those ancient scribes toiling away over clay tablets. Their legacy lives on in every word we write, a testament to the enduring power of the written word and the indomitable spirit of human curiosity. And there you have it, the tale of cuneiform, from its pragmatic beginnings to its quirky afterlife in modern culture. It's a story that reminds us of the profound impact writing systems have on shaping societies and the enduring legacy they leave behind. As we close the clay tablets on this chapter, let's carry forward the lessons of the scribes who, with every wedge-shaped mark, etched the story of humanity into the timeless annals of history. In the grand tapestry of India's history, where empires rose and fell like waves on a beach, the Chola dynasty stands out like a particularly sharp seashell. Picture this, a realm in southern India, teeming with lush landscapes and thriving trade routes, where the Cholas, like an overachieving sibling at a family reunion, turned their corner of the subcontinent into a powerhouse of culture and architecture. But how did they go from being just another clan in the crowd to leaving their mark on history, not with mere footsteps, but with grand temples that seem to defy time itself? Well, let's rewind to around 300 BCE, when a fellow by the name of Caracal was allegedly kicking things off for the Cholas. Now, myth and history often tango together, especially here, so who knows if he really tamed a ferocious elephant or built the iconic dam across the Kavari River, an engineering feat that would have made even the Romans nod in approval. What we do know is that by the early medieval period, say around 850 CE, the Cholas were flexing their muscles in the Tamil heartland thanks to a particularly savvy ruler named Vijayalaya Chola. He seized the town of Thanjavur and made it his capital, setting the stage for a dynasty that would last for over 4 centuries. Sure, we could romanticize this as a tale of destiny, but let's not forget the real drivers here, socio-political savvy and a bit of good old-fashioned warfare. The Cholas were masters of being in the right place at the right time. The Pallavas, their northern neighbours, had been strong, but by the mid-9th century they were on the decline. Meanwhile, the Pandyas in the south were playing a game of musical thrones. Enter the Cholas, who swooped in with strategic marriages, alliances, and battles to fill the power vacuum. It's like winning a game of chess because the other player fell asleep. It's still a win, but not exactly the stuff of children's bedtime stories. Now, Vijayalaya Chola didn't just sit on his laurels after capturing Thanjavur. He kicked off a building spree that would eventually lead to the architectural wonders the Cholas are famed for. But let's be honest, his early efforts were more fixer-upper than fancy penthouse. The first temples were modest, made of brick and mortar, a far cry from the grand granite edifices that would come later. These early structures were like those awkward first drafts that every writer cringes at but knows are necessary. They set the foundation, literally, for something greater. See, building temples wasn't just about giving gods a fancy place to hang out. It was a socio-political power move. Temples were community hubs, economic centres, and, perhaps most importantly, a public relations campaign that made the Cholas look like they had a direct line to the divine. This wasn't just a local phenomenon either. The Cholas were thinking big, with ambitions that stretched far beyond their backyard. By the turn of the millennium, they'd be trading with the likes of the Chinese, Arabs, and the Southeast Asian empires. Talk about networking. But back to our story. In the late 9th and early 10th centuries, the Cholas continued to expand their influence under the rule of Aditya I and his son Parantaka. These guys knew the value of a good temple and the even better value of a good army. Parantaka. I reportedly had an army of 900,000, a number that seems as inflated as a politician's resume, but it's the thought that counts, right? What's certain is that Parantaka didn't just sit around polishing his crown. He expanded the Chola territory northwards, eventually controlling all the way up to modern-day Andhra Pradesh. This expansion was crucial. Not only did it bring wealth from conquest, but it also spread the Chola brand of temple architecture. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a corporate franchise spreading its logo far and wide. The Cholas were laying the groundwork for what would become their piece de résistance, the Brihadeswara temple in Thanjavur, but that's a story for another day. Meanwhile, the socio-political landscape under the Cholas was a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, you had a flourishing economy driven by agriculture, thanks to the fertile plains of the Kaveri Delta. Rice, spices and textiles flowed like water, and trade was booming. On the other hand, society was rigidly stratified, with distinct caste hierarchies that left little room for social mobility. The Cholas, like many rulers before and after them, were adept at playing the caste dynamics to their advantage, ensuring that they stayed at the top of the heap. In this milieu, temples played a dual role. They were spiritual sanctuaries and symbols of divine kingship, but they were also economic engines. The Cholas endowed temples with land grants, which were tax-free and used to generate income. This wasn't just charity, it was smart economics. Temples became centers of learning, culture and commerce, attracting scholars, artisans and traders. They were the medieval equivalent of Silicon Valley startups, only with more incense and less Wi-Fi. As we dig deeper into the Cholas' architectural ambitions, it's clear that their temples weren't built in a vacuum. They were a response to the socio-political challenges and opportunities of their time. The Cholas understood that while swords won battles, it was the symbols, the temples, that won the hearts and minds of the people. And so, from these unassuming beginnings, the Chola dynasty set in motion a legacy of temple architecture that would echo through the ages. So, next time you're admiring a grand Chola temple, remember, behind the awe-inspiring gopurams and intricate carvings was a dynasty that knew the art of power. They used temples not just as places of worship, but as tools of statecraft, economy and culture. The Cholas may have started with humble bricks and mortar, but they were building more than temples. They were crafting an enduring legacy. And that, my friend, is how you turn a modest beginning into a monumental tale. And so, with bricks and mortar as their humble starting point, the Chola dynasty was poised to craft a legacy carved in stone, a legacy that would reach its zenith under the reign of Raja Chola. Now, if ever there was a ruler who embodied the phrase, "go big or go home," it was this guy. Raja wasn't just content with expanding his empire across the Indian subcontinent and beyond. He wanted to leave a mark that screamed, Chola, for millennia to come. Enter the Brihadeswara temple, or, as I like to call it, the ultimate architectural flex of the 11th century. Picture this. You're Raja Chola. Sitting on a throne with an empire that stretches as far as Sri Lanka and the Maldives. You've got wealth pouring in from trade routes that connect with China, the Middle East and Southeast Asia. You've got power, prestige, and a name that commands respect. What's the next logical step? Build a temple, of course, but not just any temple. A colossal, mind-boggling marvel that would make even the gods do a double-take. The Brihadeswara temple, also known as the Big Temple because subtlety is overrated, stands as a testament to Raja's vision and ambition. Completed in 1010 CE, this architectural wonder took the concept of grandeur to a whole new level. At its heart was a tower, or vimana, that soared over 66 metres, about 216 feet, into the sky. To put that in perspective, we're talking about a time when most structures barely managed to peek over the treetops, yet here was a temple playing skyscraper before it was cool. But let's not romanticize this too much. Building such a marvel wasn't just about divine inspiration, it was a logistical nightmare. Imagine the effort of hauling massive granite slabs, some weighing over 80 tons, without the help of modern machinery. Legend has it that a 6-kilometre ramp was constructed to roll these behemoths into place, a feat of engineering that makes the construction of IKEA furniture look like child's play. The labor force involved wasn't your average weekend DIY crew either. We're talking about a small army of artisans, sculptors, laborers, and architects, all working in unison to bring Raja's vision to life. While exact numbers are as elusive as a cat in a thunderstorm, it's safe to say that thousands of hands toiled to create this masterpiece. It's a vivid reminder that while the ruler gets the glory, it's the workers who lay the bricks. Now, let's chat economics because, as they say, money makes the world, or in this case, temples, go round. The Brihadeswara. Temple wasn't just a spiritual enterprise, it was a financial juggernaut. Raja Chola invested a staggering amount of resources into its construction, and it paid off. The temple acted as an economic hub, generating revenue through land grants, donations, and temple festivals that drew crowds like a medieval Coachella. It was a well-oiled machine of commerce, culture, and religion, all rolled into one. But why go through all this trouble? Was it pure piety, or was there a more strategic play at work? Spoiler alert, it's the latter. By building such an awe-inspiring temple, Raja was doing more than appeasing the gods. He was cementing his legacy, quite literally, while reinforcing his claim to divine rule. In a time when power was as transient as a summer breeze, a structure like the Brihadeswara temple was a bold statement of permanence, a stone-carved, "I was here," that would echo through the ages. And then there's the aspect of architectural one-upmanship. The Cholas weren't the only ones in the temple-building game. Their contemporaries, the Pandyas and Pallavas, were also flexing their architectural muscles with their own monumental structures. It was like an ancient version of Keeping Up with the Joneses, only instead of debating the merits of granite countertops, they were arguing over Gopuram heights and stone carvings. The Brihadeswara temple was Raja's mic drop in this grand architectural contest, a demonstration of Chola superiority that left the competition scrambling to catch up. But wait, there's more. Beyond its sheer size and grandeur, the Brihadeswara temple was a showcase of innovation. Its construction techniques, particularly the use of interlocking stones, were ahead of their time. The temple's base was designed to withstand earthquakes, a testament to the Cholas' forward-thinking approach. Inside, the walls and pillars were adorned with intricate carvings and frescoes, each telling stories of gods, kings, and celestial dances, a visual narrative that continues to dazzle visitors to this day. Yet, amidst all the glory and grandeur, it's important to remember the human cost. The labourers who toiled under the harsh sun, the craftsmen who spent years perfecting their art, and the countless others who played their part in this monumental endeavour, all were crucial to the temple's creation. It's a sobering thought that while Raja's name is etched in history, the names of those who brought his vision to life remain largely unknown. The Brihadeswara temple, in all its magnificence, is as much a testament to their toil as it is to the king's ambition. As we marvel at this architectural wonder, it's tempting to get swept up in the romance of it all. Yet, beneath the surface lies a story of power, politics, and human endeavour, a reminder that history is as much about the people who built it as it is about the rulers who commissioned it. So, next time you find yourself gazing at the Brihadeswara temple, take a moment to appreciate the craftsmanship, the innovation, and yes, the audacity of a king who dared to dream big. In a world where empires rise and fall, it's these stone giants that remind us of the enduring power of human ambition. And with that, we leave the grandiosity of Raja Chola's architectural masterpiece for now, with much more to explore about the Cholas' enduring legacy in the chapters that follow. And so, with Raja Chola's monumental mic drop echoing through the ages, it's time we shift our gaze from the towering Gopurams to the bustling life below. You see, these temples weren't just spiritual hotspots where you'd pop in to light a lamp and barter with the gods for a better harvest. No, the Chola temples were the medieval equivalent of a Swiss army knife, multifunctional, indispensable, and quite the status symbol. Beyond their spiritual allure, they were the beating hearts of economic and cultural life, hubs of activity that would make Silicon Valley look like a sleepy backwater. Let's start with the economic clout these temples wielded. Forget piggy banks. Temples were the vaults where wealth was stored, multiplied, and redistributed. Raja Chola, the master of the grand gesture, endowed the Brihadeswara temple with numerous land grants. We're talking about acres upon acres of fertile land, with the kind of productivity that would make any modern-day agribusiness green with envy. The revenue generated from these lands was tax-free and flowed directly into the temple's coffers, funding everything from maintenance to massive festivals that drew people in droves, boosting local trade like nothing else. Speaking of festivals, these weren't your average Sunday fairs. Imagine a carnival that lasts for weeks, complete with music, dance and drama, where the who's who of the Chola kingdom would rub shoulders with commoners. Temples became cultural melting pots, where artisans displayed their finest crafts. Poets recited epic tales, and dancers performed intricate Bharatanatyam routines that would put TikTok trends to shame. These gatherings weren't just for entertainment. They were networking events, marketplaces, and cultural exchanges all rolled into one, keeping the economy humming and the culture vibrant. Now, let's delve into the less glamorous but no less essential aspect of temple economics, taxes, and donations. It's easy to romanticize the idea of a temple treasure trove, piles of gold glinting in the flickering light, but the reality was a bit more mundane. Yes, donations poured in from devotees, and yes, they sometimes included precious metals and jewels. However, temples also relied heavily on a well-organized system of taxes. Picture this. Villagers were required to contribute a portion of their produce, be it rice, pulses, or spices, to the temple. In return, they received not just spiritual blessings but also social services, education, healthcare, and even the occasional loan. It was a symbiotic relationship, a community-supported system that ensured the temple's prosperity while supporting the local populace. But let's not get carried away with the idea of a benevolent temple economy. The darker side of this story involves the hoarding of wealth and power, often at the expense of the very people these institutions were meant to serve. The accumulation of land and resources by temples also meant that they wielded considerable influence, sometimes challenging even the king's authority. It was a delicate balance, a power play that required constant negotiation and sometimes resulted in conflict. The myth of endless temple treasures, while tantalizing, often masked the harsh reality of economic inequality and the concentration of wealth. To give you an idea of the scale, consider this. Some temples owned land spanning thousands of acres and employed hundreds of people. They were like medieval corporate giants, complete with a hierarchy and a robust administration to manage everything from land disputes to festival logistics. And much like today's corporations, they had to navigate the tricky waters of politics and public perception. The Cholas, astute rulers that they were, recognized the importance of temples in maintaining social order and used them as tools of statecraft, ensuring that the divine was always on their side. But what about those myths of hidden treasures, the secretive vaults rumored to be overflowing with gold and gems? The allure of temple treasures has fueled many a legend, but the truth is far less glamorous. While temples did amass considerable wealth, much of it was reinvested into the community. Treasure, when it existed, was often in the form of intricate jewelry adorning the deities or stored as reserves for emergencies. The real wealth lay in the land and the people it supported, a more sustainable and less romantic notion than the idea of glittering hoards locked away behind stone walls. So, as we peel back the layers of myth and legend, what emerges is a portrait of temples as dynamic entities, deeply intertwined with the political, economic, and social fabric of the time. They were centers of power and influence, where the divine and the mundane met, and where the Cholas cemented their legacy not just through grand architecture, but through shrewd governance. It's a story of ambition and pragmatism, of visionary rulers, and the people who toiled to bring their dreams to fruition. As we ponder the role of these temples beyond their spiritual significance, it's clear that the Cholas were playing a long game. They understood that while conquests and battles might win territories, it was the hearts and minds of the people that needed to be won over for a legacy to endure. And what better way to achieve that than through the grand, multifaceted temples that served as the lifeblood of their kingdom? This is where our story pauses for now. But hold on to your curiosity, as there's much more to uncover about the Chola dynasty and its architectural wonders. We've barely scratched the surface of their cultural and economic impact, and the road ahead promises more tales of intrigue, innovation, and the indelible mark they left on history. So, stay tuned as we continue to explore how a dynasty used more than just bricks and mortar to build an enduring empire. As we continue our deep dive into the Chola dynasty's illustrious legacy, let's swivel our attention from the temple's economic might to the artistic splendor that adorned these grand structures. If you've ever stood before a Chola temple, slack-jawed and wide-eyed, you know that these were more than just stone edifices. They were sprawling canvases where art and architecture waltzed in perfect harmony. But let's not get too misty-eyed just yet. Behind the sheer beauty of the sculptures and frescoes, there lies a tale of political maneuvering and calculated narratives, all chiseled into stone. Let's talk sculpture, a cornerstone of Chola temple artistry. The Cholas were not content with mere mortals. They aimed to capture the divine in their sculptures, and boy did they succeed. Take a stroll through the Brihadeswara temple, and you'll encounter a parade of deities frozen in time, each figure a testament to the skill of artists who turned hard granite into fluid forms. But before you get swept away by the romantic notion of artistic freedom, here's a pinch of reality. These sculptures weren't just about showcasing craftsmanship. Oh no, they were political propaganda masquerading as art. Consider the statues of Shiva, often depicted in his Nataraja form, performing the cosmic dance. On the surface, it's a spiritual marvel, a celebration of divine rhythm. But peel back that layer, and you see a deliberate message. The Chola king, likened to Shiva, was the cosmic ruler, maintaining order in the universe, or at least in his kingdom. These sculptures were the medieval equivalent of political posters, a stone-cold reminder of who held the power. And let's not forget the frescoes, those vibrant paintings that adorned the temple walls. Each brushstroke was a narrative thread, weaving stories of divine beings, epic battles, and, of course, the glory of the Chola kings. These were not just artistic expressions, they were curated histories, edited and approved by the ruling class. The frescoes served as both religious instruction and royal propaganda, ensuring that visitors left with a reinforced sense of the king's divine right to rule. But who were these artists who brought stone and paint to life? We know precious little about them, as their names have mostly been lost to history. They were the unsung heroes, the anonymous geniuses whose work continues to awe us. While there's a certain romanticism in the idea of the lone artist toiling away in anonymity, the reality was far more collaborative. Teams of sculptors, painters, and craftsmen worked in tandem, each contributing their expertise to create a cohesive masterpiece. It was a well-oiled creative machine, producing art that was both personal and politically charged. Now, let's inject some economic context into this artistic narrative. Crafting these masterpieces wasn't just about divine inspiration, it was a costly affair. The Chola kings poured resources into acquiring the finest materials, whether it was granite from distant quarries or pigments imported along trade routes. It was a testament to their economic prowess that they could afford such extravagance. But why invest so heavily in art? Simple. Art was a tool of legitimacy. The more grandiose the temple, the more it reinforced the king's status as a ruler chosen by the gods themselves. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a social media presence. Just as today's influencers curate their online personas, the Cholas curated their divine image through temple art. Every sculpture, every fresco was a status update, a proclamation of their power and piety. And just like the perfectly filtered Instagram post, it was all about maintaining an image, even if reality was a bit messier. Speaking of messiness, let's debunk some myths surrounding the artistic freedom of the time. It's tempting to imagine the Chola era as a golden age for artists, free to express their creativity. But the truth is, artistic freedom was often bounded by political lines. Artists worked under the patronage of the king, and their creations were expected to align with state narratives. Deviating from this script could mean losing patronage, or worse. So while the art of the Cholas might appear to be an uninhibited celebration of creativity, it was often a carefully curated reflection of the political landscape. But don't let the stone-cold politics overshadow the sheer brilliance of the art itself. Take the magnificent bronze sculptures, for instance. These icons, particularly the Chola bronzes, were a revolutionary leap in artistry. Using the lost wax technique, Sculptors achieved a level of detail and precision that was nothing short of miraculous. These weren't just religious icons, they were objects of beauty that transcended their spiritual purpose. The famous Nataraja bronze, a masterpiece of balance and grace, is a perfect example of this. It's as if the artist captured lightning in a bottle, a moment of divine movement frozen in time. Yet, even in their brilliance, these bronzes were also statements of power. They were portable, able to be carried in processions, serving to remind the populace of the king's divine favour. The interplay of art and politics was as intricate as the sculptures themselves. So, while we admire the artistry, let's remember the political undertones that shaped these creations. They were multifaceted, much like the society that produced them, a blend of devotion, politics, and economics, all wrapped in stone and bronze. As we wrap up this chapter on Chola art, it's clear that the dynasty's legacy is as much about what they created as why they created it. These artistic contributions were not merely decorative, they were integral to the Chola's strategy for maintaining power and influence. Behind every sculpture, every fresco, lay a story of ambition and control, of rulers who understood the power of art to both inspire and subjugate. And as we move forward, exploring more of the Chola's enduring impact, remember that their art was not just a reflection of their time, it was a tool that helped shape it. So, as we pause to admire the artistic splendor of the Chola temples, let's keep our eyes peeled for the narratives carved into every stone and painted on every wall. There's more to explore, more myths to bust, and more stories to uncover as we continue our journey through the fascinating world of the Chola dynasty. Stay tuned, because the road ahead promises to be as intricate and awe-inspiring as the art that adorned their temples. Speaking of awe-inspiring journeys through history, let's dive into the legacy of Chola temple architecture, a legacy that stretches like an intricate tapestry from the 10th century to the modern skyline of India. These temples, with their towering vimanas and sprawling courtyards, were more than just stone and mortar. They were the heartbeats of a civilization. And if you think they're just relics of a bygone era, think again. Their influence is like that one catchy song that you can't get out of your head. It lingers on, subtly shaping the world around you. First, let's address the myths. The romanticized vision of Chola temples often paints them as divine gifts dropped from the heavens, pristine and untouched by the ravages of time. But let's be real. Maintaining these colossal structures was about as easy as managing a rock band on tour. The gritty reality involved constant repairs, with artisans and labourers working tirelessly to keep the gods' abodes from crumbling back to dust. And while legend speaks of mystical treasures hidden within, what these temples really housed were the sweat and toil of countless unnamed workers. It's a reminder that behind every grand facade is a backbone of grit and labour. Now, the Chola builders weren't just showing off their architectural prowess for the fun of it. Each temple was a statement, a declaration of political and spiritual supremacy. They were like the ancient world's version of skyscrapers, reaching for the heavens as a testament to the ruler's ambition and the empire's prosperity. And just like modern skyscrapers, they were symbols of progress and power. But unlike our glass and steel giants, Chola temples were intricately connected to the rhythm of life around them, shaping and being shaped by the society they served. Fast forward to the present, and the influence of Chola architecture is still as unmistakable as a peacock in a pigeon coop. Walk through any southern Indian city, and you'll see echoes of Chola design in the gopurams of local temples, the elaborate carvings on doorways, and even in the layout of traditional homes. These elements have been absorbed into the cultural DNA of the region, a testament to the enduring appeal of Chola aesthetics. It's like the architectural equivalent of a family heirloom passed down through generations, each adding their own touch while preserving the essence of the original. But enough about romantic legacies. Let's get our hands dirty with some economic context. Building these temples was no small feat, and their construction was a massive economic undertaking. Resources were funneled from across the empire, with materials sourced from as far as 50 miles away, transported on the backs of elephants and carts. The financial investment was staggering, akin to a medieval moon landing with the promise of spiritual returns rather than celestial discoveries. The Chola rulers understood the interplay of economics and devotion. By investing in temples, they weren't just buying divine favour, they were ensuring the economic vitality of their realm. Temples were economic powerhouses, employing thousands, supporting local economies, and attracting pilgrim tourism long before Instagram made it cool. They were the original economic engines, fueling trade, crafts, and culture. A legacy that resonates with today's cultural tourism industry. And let's not overlook the political savvy at play here. The Cholas were masters of using temples to consolidate power, reinforcing their divine right to rule. They understood that while swords could conquer lands, it was the temples that could conquer hearts. By associating their reign with divine architecture, they etched their names into the stone of history. Quite literally. It was a strategy as craftily executed as a well-played game of chess, with temples serving as both the board and the pieces. So, what's the takeaway from this architectural saga? The Chola temples were more than just places of worship. They were the epicenters of a vibrant civilization, the nodes where spirituality, politics, and economics intersected. They remind us that history is less about the stones themselves and more about the stories they tell. The stories of visionaries who dared to dream big and of the countless others whose dreams they were built upon. As we wrap up this journey through the legacy of Chola temple architecture, let's take a moment to reflect on how these ancient wonders continue to influence us today. In an era where cultural identity is as contested as ever, these temples stand firm as symbols of resilience and continuity. They are a bridge between the past and the present, reminding us of the power of human creativity and the enduring nature of cultural heritage. It's a poignant reminder that while the tools and materials may change, the human spirit of innovation and expression remains constant. And for a touch of humour, consider this. In a world where modern architecture sometimes resembles a game of who can build the weirdest looking structure, the Cholas were ahead of the curve by centuries. They built temples that not only stood the test of time, but also continue to inspire awe and admiration. It's like they were the original trendsetters, proving that true style never goes out of fashion. So, as we close the book on this chapter of history, remember that the legacy of the Chola temples is not just about the past. It's a living, breathing influence that continues to shape our world today. Whether you're admiring a modern building that echoes their design, or finding inspiration in their enduring artistry, the Chola temples stand as a testament to the timeless power of human ingenuity. And that, my friends, is a legacy worth celebrating.